Tonight, we're going to explore one of the oldest and most honourable houses in all of Westeros, a family whose castle sits so high in the clouds that it seems to touch the sky itself. We'll journey through 8,000 years of history, from the Age of Heroes to the present day, discovering how House Arryn and the Vale of Arryn have endured through conquest and peace, through triumph and tragedy. We'll understand what it means when a house's words are as high as honour, and we'll contemplate how geography and principle have shaped one of the Seven Kingdoms' most distinctive cultures. But don't worry, this isn't going to be a tale of endless battle and political intrigue, though both certainly play their parts. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the mists of ancient legend, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the quiet strength of tradition, and the human stories behind the Falcon banners. We'll examine how a fortress built in the clouds became a symbol of impregnability, how knights and honour became inseparable from the Vale's identity, and how isolation can be both a blessing and a curse. If you enjoy these calm explorations of history, both real and legendary, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community. Your presence makes these journeys more meaningful. So settle in, let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath, and feel it move through you. And let's begin our slow drift through the story of the Falcon and the Moon, of knights and honour, of mountains and sky. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. Just listen, and let the story of House Arryn unfold before you like morning mist in a mountain valley. The world can wait. For now, there are only voices from the past and the quiet space you've made for yourself tonight. Before we can understand House Arryn and the lords who would build their seat among the clouds, we need to understand the land that shaped them. The Vale of Arryn, or simply the Vale as it's known throughout Westeros, is perhaps the most naturally defended region in all the Seven Kingdoms, a place where geography itself seems to have conspired to create a fortress. It's a land of contradictions, of fertile valleys surrounded by harsh mountains, of isolation paired with prosperity, of natural beauty that exists alongside constant danger. The Vale is enclosed on three sides by the Mountains of the Moon, a treacherous range of peaks and passes that has protected the region for thousands of years. These aren't the rounded, gentle mountains you might find in more forgiving lands. They're sharp, cruel peaks that rise like jagged teeth toward the sky, their summits often lost in clouds, their slopes home to avalanches, rockfalls, and worse. The highest of these mountains is the Giant's Lance, the tallest peak in all of Westeros, a mountain so high that its summit is perpetually covered in snow, even in the height of summer. From its peak, it's said, you can see for 100 miles in every direction, though few have ever made the climb to verify this claim. Within the protective embrace of these mountains lie three main valleys, each with its own character, each contributing to the Vale's prosperity. These valleys are why the region is called the Vale, not for any single valley, but for the collection of them, the fertile lowlands that exist in the shadow of the peaks. The soil here is rich, fed by mountain streams and protected from the worst storms by the surrounding heights. The valleys produce grain and cattle, fruits and vegetables, enough not just to feed the Vale's own population, but to export to other regions. In times of war, when other kingdoms see their fields burned and their harvests destroyed, the Vale's valleys often remain untouched, protected by those impassable mountains. The easternmost of the main valleys is the smallest but perhaps the most important, for it contains the Bay of Crabs and the city of Gulltown, the Vale's primary port and its window to the wider world. Gulltown is where ships from across the narrow sea dock, bringing spices and silks, wines and exotic goods, and taking away Vale grain and cattle. The city has made the Graftons, the lords of Gulltown, wealthy beyond measure, and it's ensured that the Vale, for all its isolation, has never been completely cut off from the currents of history and trade that flow through Westeros and beyond. The Central Valley is the largest and most prosperous, a broad expanse of farmland and pasture, where the majority of the Vale's population lives. Here you'll find the holdings of the great Vale houses, the Corbrays and Belmores, the Templetons and Hunters. Small villages dot the landscape, connected by well-maintained roads, their fields changing with the seasons from the green of spring planting to the gold of autumn harvest. Rivers wind through this valley, their waters clear and cold from the mountain snows, providing irrigation and power for mills. It's a gentle, peaceful land, this central valley, especially when compared to the harsh mountains that surround it. The Western Valley is narrower and more wild, close to the mountain slopes where the clans make their homes. Here the farming is harder, the settlements more scattered, the danger more present. But this valley too contributes to the Vale's strength, producing hardy mountain ponies and the fierce warriors who know how to fight in difficult terrain. It's in this western region that the boundary between civilized Vale and wild mountain becomes blurred, where raiding parties from the clans are most likely to strike, and where the constant low-level conflict between the Highlanders and the Valley Lords has persisted for thousands of years. But the mountains themselves deserve our attention, for they've shaped Vale history as much as the valleys have. The Mountains of the Moon are not empty wastelands. They're home to the mountain clans, the hill tribes who have lived in these peaks since before recorded history. These clans, the Burned Men and the Stone Crows, the Moon Brothers and the Painted Dogs and a dozen others, are fiercely independent peoples who have never bent the knee to any lord. They live by raiding, descending from their mountain holds to steal cattle and grain, taking what they need from the prosperous valleys below. The relationship between the Vale Lords and the mountain clans is complex, shaped by thousands of years of conflict and accommodation. The clans cannot be conquered. Not really. The mountains are their fortress, far more impregnable than any castle. They know every pass and cave, every hidden trail and secret valley. When Vale Knights ride into the mountains to punish a raid, the clansmen simply melt away into the peaks, appearing again weeks later to strike somewhere else. And yet the clans cannot conquer the Vale either. They lack the numbers and the organisation, the weapons and armour of the knights. So the conflict continues, a constant low-level warfare that has become simply a fact of life in the region. The mountains also serve a more benign purpose. They're the source of the streams and rivers that water the valleys. The snow that falls on the peaks in winter melts slowly through spring and summer, providing a steady flow of water even in the driest months. The mountains shield the valleys from the worst of the storms that blow in from the narrow sea, creating a more moderate climate than you'd find in the exposed lowlands. And perhaps most importantly, the mountains make the Vale nearly impossible to invade. There are only 3 practical ways into the Vale for an army, and all of them are easily defended. The high road comes from the south, winding through the mountains in a path that takes days to traverse. This road is guarded by the Bloody Gate, a fortress built into a narrow cleft in the mountains where the road passes between sheer cliff walls. The Bloody Gate is a choke point that can be held by a relatively small force against an army many times its size. Attackers must approach in a narrow column, unable to bring their numbers to bear while defenders rain arrows and rocks down from the heights. In all the thousands of years of its existence, the Bloody Gate has never been taken by force from the south. The other 2 approaches are even more difficult. From the west, armies would have to pass through the mountains themselves, through territories controlled by the hostile clans, along trails barely wide enough for a single horse. No large army has ever successfully invaded the Vale from the west. The eastern approach, from the sea through Gulltown, is possible in theory, but it would require a fleet large enough to transport an invasion force, and even then the defenders would have time to repair as the ships approached. The city's walls are strong, and behind them lies hundreds of miles of territory that an invader would have to conquer valley by valley. This natural defensibility has had profound effects on Vale history and culture. Because the Vale has rarely been successfully invaded, its people have developed a sense of security, even isolation, that's different from other regions of Westeros. Where the Riverlands have been conquered and reconquered countless times, Where the Stormlands and the Reach have seen their borders shift with every generation, the Vale has remained largely unchanged. The same families that ruled here thousands of years ago still rule today. The same castles that protected the first men still stand, their walls unbreached. But this security has also created a certain insularity. The Vale Lords, protected by their mountains, have sometimes been slow to involve themselves in the conflicts of the wider realm. Why risk their knights and soldiers in foreign wars when they're safe behind their mountain walls? This tendency toward isolation would have consequences throughout Vale history, sometimes allowing the region to prosper while others suffered, sometimes leaving them unprepared when danger did finally reach them. The land itself shapes the people who live there in other ways too. The constant presence of the mountains, their peaks visible from almost everywhere in the valleys, creates a particular mindset. The Vale people are used to looking up, to seeing those heights, to understanding themselves in relation to that vertical landscape. Perhaps this is part of why House Arryn chose to build their seat at the top of the Giant's Lance, why they made the climb to the Eyrie part of approaching their power. The mountains teach humility. They teach perspective. They remind you that there are always greater heights to aspire to. The Falcon, House Arryn's sigil, is also a creature of these mountains and valleys. Falcons nest in the high peaks and hunt in the lowlands, moving between heights and depths with ease. They see everything from above, their vision sharp and far-ranging. They strike with precision and speed, then return to their lofty perches. It's an apt symbol for the lords who would rule this land, who would look down from their castle in the clouds and watch over the valleys below. The seasons affect the Vale differently than other regions. Winter here is harsh, certainly, with the mountain passes becoming completely impassable, the peaks buried under snow that won't melt until spring. But the valleys, protected by the mountains, are often more moderate than you'd find in the exposed lands of the Riverlands or the north. The summers are pleasant, warm but not oppressively hot, with cool mountain breezes tempering the heat. Autumn is perhaps the most beautiful season, when the valleys turn gold with harvest, and the mountain slopes are painted with the colours of changing leaves. This was the land that the first men found when they crossed the narrow sea all those thousands of years ago. This was the land they fought for and eventually claimed. A land of plenty protected by harsh barriers, a land where you could be safe if you could defend the approaches, a land where the mountains themselves seemed to promise that those who held the heights could never be brought low. It was a land that would shape dynasties and create legends. It was a land waiting for the Arryns. The first men had ruled the Vale for perhaps 2,000 years when new invaders began crossing the narrow sea. These were the Andals, and they would change everything. They came not as a single force, but in waves over centuries, warrior peoples following their new gods, the Seven, carrying iron weapons that were superior to the bronze of the first men. And among these Andal warriors was a man who would become legend, a knight whose story would be told for 6,000 years, though separating truth from myth in his tale is perhaps impossible now. His name was Sir Artys Arryn, and he would be remembered as the Falcon Knight, the founder of the dynasty that still rules the Vale today. The legends say that Sir Artys rode upon a giant falcon, that he soared above the battlefield and struck from the sky like the bird of prey whose name he bore. They say he could command the falcons of the mountains, that they would answer his call and fight beside him. They say he was blessed by the Seven, that the warrior himself guided his sword arm, that the mother protected him from harm. These stories have been repeated so many times, embellished with each telling, that finding the historical Artys beneath the layers of legend is like trying to see the bottom of a deep, still pool. What we can say with more confidence is this: Artys Arryn was an Andal warrior of exceptional skill, who arrived in the Vale sometime around 6,000 years before Aegon's conquest. He came not alone, but with 6 other Andal champions, each leading their own followers, each seeking to carve out a kingdom in this rich, protected land. The Vale at this time was ruled by the first men, divided among several petty kingdoms. The Bronze Kings of House Royce were the most powerful, ruling from runestone with ancient bronze armour that had been passed down through countless generations. There were others too, lesser kings whose names have been lost to history, men who ruled their valleys and thought themselves secure behind their mountain walls. The Andals had advantages that the first men lacked. They had iron, stronger and sharper than bronze, capable of holding an edge that bronze could never match. They had the faith of the Seven, an organised religion with a hierarchy and structure that could unite disparate groups in common purpose. They had a tradition of knighthood, of warriors sworn to codes of honour and bound by oaths, creating a military culture that was more sophisticated than the tribal organisation of the first men. And they had the desperation of invaders who had crossed the sea with no home to return to, who had to conquer or die. The conflict between the Andals and the first men in the Vale culminated in what the histories call the Battle of the Seven Stars. This battle, fought somewhere in the Central Valley, though the exact location has been lost to time, pitted the Andal champions against the combined forces of the first men kings. 7 Andal warriors, Artys Arryn among them, faced the armies of the Vale's defenders in a struggle that would determine the future of the region. The legends say the battle lasted from dawn to dusk, that the Andal knights fought with such valour that the very stars came down from the sky to aid them, that the 7 themselves intervened on behalf of their faithful warriors. The more prosaic reality, pieced together from fragments in the histories, suggests a hard-fought battle where superior Andal weapons and tactics eventually overcame the numerical advantage of the first men. The Bronze Kings fell, their ancient armour no protection against iron swords. The lesser kings either died in battle or fled into the mountains. By sunset, the Andals controlled the field, and with it the future of the Vale. This single battle, this one day of violence, ended thousands of years of First Men rule and began a new era that continues to the present day. After the battle, the 7 Andal champions divided the Vale among themselves, each taking a portion of the conquered territory and establishing their own house. Sir Artys Arryn claimed the largest share and declared himself King of Mountain and Vale, the supreme ruler over the entire region. Whether he achieved this through the consent of the other Andal lords or through further conquest isn't entirely clear. What matters is that by the time the dust settled, House Arryn ruled the Vale, and the other Andal families, the Corbrays and Graftons, the Belmores and Templetons and the rest, acknowledged Arryn's supremacy. But what of House Royce, the ancient Bronze Kings? Here the story takes an interesting turn. Unlike some conquered peoples who were exterminated or driven out, the Royces survived the Andal invasion. They bent the knee to the new Arryn kings, accepting their defeat but maintaining their ancestral seat at Runestone and their position as great lords of the Vale. Over time, the Royces would convert from the old gods to the faith of the 7, though they maintained certain traditions, including their practice of wearing bronze armour inscribed with runes that connected them to their ancient past. This accommodation between conqueror and conquered, this willingness to incorporate the old into the new, would become characteristic of Vale culture, creating a society that blended First Men and Andal traditions more successfully than almost anywhere else in Westeros. Sir Artys Arryn's greatest achievement, the one that would define his dynasty for all the millennia to come, was the construction of the Eyrie. The decision to build a castle at the top of the Giant's Lance, rather than in the more accessible valleys, was audacious to the point of madness. The peak was 600 feet of sheer cliff face, accessible only by a treacherous climb. Building materials would have to be hauled up by rope and pulley. Workers would labour in thin mountain air, constantly in danger of falling to their deaths. The construction would take years, perhaps decades, and cost enormous amounts of gold and countless lives. Why would Artys choose such a difficult location? The legends say he was guided by the 7, that the father showed him in a vision where his seat should be. A more practical explanation suggests several motivations. First, the Eyrie would be completely impregnable, No army could scale those sheer cliffs, no siege engines could reach it, no invader could hope to take it by force. It would be the ultimate expression of security. A castle that could never fall. Second, the location was symbolic. The king who sat highest, who literally looked down upon all his subjects, demonstrated his supreme authority in the most visible way possible. Third, and perhaps most important to an Andal warlord newly victorious over the First Men, an impregnable fortress meant security for a new dynasty that had many enemies and uncertain legitimacy. The construction of the Eyrie is a story in itself, one filled with danger and death. Innovation and determination. The builders used the natural features of the mountain, finding flat areas where towers could be raised, creating a castle that seemed to grow from the stone itself. 7 slender towers rose from the mountain top, their white stone visible for miles in every direction, pale against the grey of the mountain and the blue of the sky. These towers were connected by stone bridges and walkways, creating a complex that was both beautiful and functional. A work of architecture that would be remembered as one of the wonders of Westeros. The highest tower contained the High Hall, where the King of Mountain and Vale would sit in judgment and receive his subjects. This hall had a floor of blue-veined white marble, weirwood rafters dark with age, and windows of moon glass that filled the room with a pale, cold light. But the hall's most distinctive feature was the moon door, an opening in the floor that looked straight down 600 feet to the valley below. The moon door served as both execution method and symbol. Those judged guilty of crimes against the king could be thrown through it, their screams lasting long seconds as they fell to their death on the rocks below. But it also served as a constant reminder that the Eyrie existed between earth and sky, that those who ruled from here existed in a space between the mortal and the divine. As the Eyrie rose, Artys also needed to create a way for people to actually reach his mountaintop castle. The solution was a series of way castles built into the mountainside at intervals along the climbing path. The first was stone, a fortress at the base of the ascent where visitors would leave their horses and begin the climb on foot. Higher up was snow, a smaller castle built into a shelf of rock partway up the mountain. And finally, near the summit, was sky, the last way castle before the Eyrie itself. Between these way castles, the path wound back and forth across the cliff face, sometimes carved into the rock, sometimes consisting of wooden stairs and rope bridges. The climb from stone to sky could take half a day for a fit person, longer for the elderly or infirm, and it was deliberately designed to be exhausting and intimidating. Anyone who wished to petition the King of Mountain and Vale would arrive tired, humbled by the climb, impressed by the engineering, and very aware of how far they could fall if they displeased their host. At the base of the Giant's Lance, Artys also built the Gates of the Moon, a more conventional castle that served as the Arryn's winter residence. When snow closed the path to the Eyrie, making it inaccessible for months at a time, the king and his court would descend to the Gates of the Moon, where life was more comfortable and communication with the rest of the realm was possible. This dual castle system, high and low, summer and winter, became another distinctive feature of Arryn rule. The transformation from First Men culture to Andal culture in the Vale happened gradually over several generations. The faith of the Seven spread through the valleys, with septs being built in every village and town. The old gods weren't completely forgotten. Heart trees still stood in some godswoods, and some lords, particularly the Royces, maintained the old traditions even after converting. But the Seven became dominant, and with them came new customs, new laws, new ways of thinking about honour and duty and the proper ordering of society. Knighthood became central to Vale culture in a way it would in few other regions. The Andals had brought the tradition of knights with them. Warriors who swore sacred oaths and followed a code of chivalry. In the Vale, this tradition flourished. Sons of both great lords and minor knights were trained from childhood in the arts of war, learning swordplay and horsemanship, studying the codes of knightly conduct. When they came of age, they would be knighted in ceremonies held in the septs, swearing before the Seven to defend the weak, honour women, fight bravely, and serve faithfully. The Vale would produce some of the finest knights in Westeros, warriors renowned throughout the Seven Kingdoms for their skill and honour. This emphasis on knighthood and honour would eventually lead to the Vale being called the truest seat of chivalry in all of Westeros. While other regions might produce fiercer warriors or more cunning commanders, the Vale Knights were considered the most honourable, the most likely to follow the codes of chivalry even when pragmatism might suggest otherwise. Whether this reputation was entirely earned or partly the result of the Vale's isolation, which meant its knights faced fewer of the hard choices that could compromise honour, is an interesting question. But the reputation persisted, and as high as honour became words that meant something, that represented a particular way of being in the world. Sir Artys Arryn ruled as king for many years, or so the legends say. Some accounts claim he lived to be 100 years old, still vigorous in his final years. Others suggest a more normal lifespan. What's certain is that he established a dynasty that would endure for 6,000 years, that would survive the conquest by the Targaryens and continue to the present day. He created not just a kingdom, but a culture, a way of life that balanced the old and new, that incorporated First Men traditions into an Andal framework, that made the Vale distinctive among the Seven Kingdoms. The story of the giant falcon was probably invented later, a symbolic representation of Artys's swiftness in battle, to his ability to strike from unexpected angles, his mastery of the high ground. But symbols matter, and the falcon became inseparable from House Arryn, appearing on their banners, their shields, their seals. The white falcon flying against a sky-blue field became one of the most recognisable sigils in Westeros, a symbol of the heights, both literal and figurative, that House Arryn represented. As the first Andal kingdom in Westeros, the Vale became a model for others. Other Andal invaders, seeing the success of Artys and his companions, sought to replicate it in other regions. The conquest of the rest of Westeros by the Andals would take centuries, but it began here, in these mountain-protected valleys, with a knight who may or may not have ridden a giant falcon, but who certainly soared higher than his contemporaries could have imagined. The transition from conquest to rule, from warlord to king, from Andal invader to Lord of the Vale, was Artys Arryn's true achievement. He didn't just win battles, he built something that would last. The Eyrie stands today, its white towers still visible from the valleys, still impregnable, still a symbol of the dynasty he founded. The Vale lords who descend from his companions still rule their holdfasts. The knightly culture he helped establish still shapes how Vale warriors think about honour and duty. 6,000 years is a very long time, long enough for civilizations to rise and fall, for languages to change, for the very face of the world to be transformed. But House Arryn endures, and the story of the Falcon Knight, however embellished by time and legend, remains the foundation on which that endurance was built. Between the founding of House Arryn by Sir Artys and the arrival of Aegon, the Conqueror stretched nearly 4,000 years, a span of time so vast that it's difficult for us to truly comprehend. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen in less time. Languages have evolved beyond recognition. And yet House Arryn endured throughout this enormous period, ruling the Vale from their castle in the clouds, maintaining traditions that stretched back to the age of heroes, adapting when necessary but never breaking. To understand the Vale as it existed when the dragons came, we need to explore this long age of the Arryn kings, to see how centuries of relative peace and isolation shaped the culture and people of this mountain-protected realm. The histories of this period are fragmentary, incomplete in the way that all ancient histories are. The maesters have done their best to piece together a coherent narrative from old songs, scattered records, and the oral traditions preserved by the great houses. But there are gaps, contradictions, periods where we know almost nothing about what was happening in the Vale. What we can see, looking at the broad sweep of these millennia, are patterns rather than specific events, cycles that repeated themselves across generations. Constants that defined what it meant to be of the Vale. One such constant was the mountain clans. Every generation of Arryn kings had to deal with raids from the Mountains of the Moon. The clans would descend from their high holds, particularly in late summer and autumn, to steal cattle and sheep, to take grain from the harvest, sometimes to kidnap unwary travellers for ransom. The Vale lords would respond with punitive expeditions, riding into the mountains to burn clan holds and recover stolen goods. Sometimes these expeditions were successful, sometimes the clansmen melted into the peaks and the knights returned empty-handed. It was a pattern that had existed since before the Andals came, and would continue long after, a constant low-level conflict that was simply part of life in the Vale. Some Arryn kings tried to solve the clan problem permanently. King Osric Arryn, who ruled perhaps 2,000 years before the conquest, launched what he called the Final Campaign, a massive effort to clear the mountains of the clans once and for all. He led 10,000 men into the peaks in early summer, planning to spend the entire campaigning season hunting down every clan hold. The campaign lasted 3 months and cost hundreds of lives. The Vale forces found and destroyed perhaps a dozen clan villages, killed or captured several hundred clansmen, and drove the rest deeper into the mountains. King Osric returned to the Eyrie declaring victory, certain that he had ended the threat forever. By the next autumn, the raids had resumed. The clans had simply waited in their high refuges until the Vale army withdrew, then returned to their traditional territories. The mountains protected them as surely as they protected the Vale itself. This lesson was learned and relearned by successive generations. That the clans could be suppressed but never eliminated. That they were as much a permanent feature of the Vale as the mountains themselves. Eventually, the Vale lords came to accept this reality, maintaining garrisons at key points, organising swift responses to raids, but no longer dreaming of a final solution to a problem that had no solution. The relationship between House Arryn and the other great houses of the Vale was generally stable across these long centuries, though not without occasional tensions. The Royces at Runestone maintained their position as the second most powerful house in the Vale, their ancient lineage and their bronze armour marking them as different, even as they adapted to Andal culture. The histories record several instances where Royce lords grew ambitious, where they seemed to be considering whether they might reclaim the supremacy their ancestors had lost to the Andals. But these ambitions never quite crystallised into open rebellion, perhaps because the Royces understood that the other Vale houses, all of Andal descent, would never support a return to First Men rule. House Corbray of Heartsholme was another major power, famous for their Valyrian steel sword, Lady Forlorn, one of perhaps 200 such blades in all of Westeros. How the Corbrays came to possess a Valyrian steel sword is lost to history. The blade was ancient even when the Andals arrived, but its presence gave them prestige and military advantage. A skilled warrior wielding Lady Forlorn could cut through ordinary steel armour, could hold their own against multiple opponents. The Corbrays jealously guarded this treasure, passing it from father to son across thousands of years. The Graftons of Gulltown grew wealthy from trade, their port city bringing in revenues that rivaled those of the Arryns themselves. There were periods when this wealth translated into political ambition, when Grafton lords suggested that perhaps the King of Mountain and Vale should reside in prosperous, accessible Gulltown rather than in a castle that could only be reached by climbing a mountain. These suggestions were never well received by the other Vale houses, who understood that whoever controlled Gulltown controlled the Vale's access to the outside world, and that this was too much power to give to any single house other than the Arryns. The succession of Arryn kings followed the usual pattern of hereditary monarchy. Fathers succeeded by sons, occasionally by brothers when direct heirs were lacking. The histories preserve the names of perhaps one king in 10, those who did something memorable enough to be worth recording. King Robar Arryn, called Robar the Righteous, who ruled around 1500 years before the conquest, was remembered for reforming the Vale's laws, creating a comprehensive legal code that balanced Andal customs with First Men traditions. His laws governed everything from inheritance disputes to the punishment for crimes, from the obligations of vassals to their lords to the rights of small folk to appeal unjust treatment. These laws became the foundation of Vale justice for centuries. They were considered fair, at least by the standards of the time, and they gave the Vale a reputation for order and predictability that attracted merchants and craftsmen from other regions. If you knew the law and followed it, you would be protected by it. This legal stability was one reason the Vale prospered even as other regions were torn by constant warfare and uncertainty. Queen Lysa Arryn, one of the few women to rule the Vale in her own right, reigned about 1,000 years before the conquest during a period when the male line had temporarily failed. Her succession was contested by several male cousins who argued that women could not inherit, but Lysa had the support of the most powerful Vale lords and the blessing of the faith. She ruled for 30 years, proving to be a capable administrator and a shrewd diplomat. She negotiated a lasting peace with the Stormlands to the south, married her children strategically to other great houses, and strengthened the Eyries' defences. When she died, her son succeeded her without incident, but the precedent had been set that in the Vale, women could inherit and rule if the situation demanded it. The relationship between the Vale and its neighbouring kingdoms varied across the centuries. The Riverlands to the west were a constant source of both opportunity and danger. The Riverlands had no natural defences like the Vale's mountains, and they were conquered repeatedly by different powers, the Ironborn from the Iron Islands, the Storm Kings from the south, occasionally the Kings of the Rock from the west. Sometimes the Vale Kings intervened in Riverlands conflicts, supporting one faction or another, occasionally claiming parts of the Riverlands for themselves. But these ventures beyond the mountains were rarely successful in the long term. The Vale's strength was defensive. Its mountains protected it, but also limited its ability to project power beyond them. With the north, the relationship was distant but generally peaceful. The north was too far away and too focused on its own concerns, the wildlings beyond the wall, the harsh winters, the vast distances of its own territory to pose a threat to the Vale. Occasionally there would be trade, marriages between northern and Vale houses creating temporary alliances, but for the most part the two kingdoms existed in parallel, each secure in its own region, neither particularly interested in the other's affairs. The Stormlands to the south were more problematic. The border between the Vale and the Stormlands was not clearly defined by natural features the way the Vale's other borders were. There were disputed territories, valleys that both kingdoms claimed, and these disputes occasionally flared into border wars. These conflicts were usually limited affairs, neither side willing to commit to a full-scale war, both sides knowing that any territory gained would likely be lost again in the next generation. After Queen Alysa's peace treaty, the border became more stable, though minor disputes continued. The faith of the Seven grew in power and influence throughout these centuries. The Vale became known as one of the most pious regions in Westeros, its lords and knights devoted to the Seven, its small folk regular in their worship, its septs among the finest in the realm. High septons were often drawn from the Vale nobility, the Arryns and other great houses sending their younger sons to join the faith, where they could rise to positions of power and influence. This close relationship between the faith and the Vale lords was mutually beneficial. The faith provided legitimacy and moral authority to Arryn rule, while the Arryns provided protection and patronage to the faith. The most devout, the Council of High-ranking Septons who chose each new High Septon, often included several members from the Vale. This gave the Vale significant influence over the direction of the faith, and it ensured that the faith's teachings aligned well with Vale culture and values. The emphasis on knightly virtues, on honour and duty, on protecting the weak and upholding justice, These became central to the faith's message throughout Westeros, but they had special resonance in the Vale where they were lived as well as preached. Tournaments became an important part of Vale culture during this long period. The concept of the tournament, where knights gathered to display their martial skills in controlled combat, had been brought by the Andals and developed over centuries into elaborate affairs. The Vale lords, with their emphasis on knightly honour and their relative prosperity, hosted some of the finest tournaments in Westeros. These events served multiple purposes. They allowed young knights to prove themselves, to gain honour and recognition. They provided entertainment and spectacle for the common folk. They created opportunities for political alliances, marriages arranged, treaties negotiated. And they reinforced the martial culture that kept the Vale's warriors sharp even during long periods of peace. The tourney grounds at Gulltown could accommodate thousands of spectators, with lists for jousting, yards for melee combat, archery ranges, and pavilions for the competing knights. When a great tournament was announced, knights would come from across the Vale, and even from other kingdoms, seeking glory and prizes. The winner of a major tourney might receive a purse of 1,000 gold dragons, a fortune for most knights, along with honour that would last a lifetime. The losers would have their armour and horses forfeit, a serious cost, but one they willingly risked for the chance at fame. These tournaments also provided a venue for the songs and stories that preserved Vale history and culture. Singers would perform during the feast that accompanied the fighting, telling tales of ancient heroes, of Artys Arryn and his falcon, of famous knights and their deeds. These songs served an important function in a society where most people couldn't read. They were how history was preserved and transmitted, how each generation learned who they were and where they came from. These singers had to be careful, of course. A song that offended a powerful lord could be dangerous for the singer, but a clever minstrel could weave truth and entertainment together in ways that pleased their audience, while preserving important memories. The Eyrie itself evolved over these long centuries. Each generation of Arryns added something: a new tower, an improved defence, more comfortable living quarters. The castle that Artys built had been functional but austere, designed for defence rather than comfort. His descendants, ruling in times of peace and prosperity, could afford to make the Eyrie beautiful as well as impregnable. Gardens were created on the terraces, fed by mountain streams, growing flowers and herbs despite the thin mountain air. The halls were decorated with tapestries depicting the history of House Arryn, with carved weirwood furniture, with treasures brought from across the narrow sea. The process of climbing to the Eyrie became ritualised. Visitors knew that the climb was a test, that arriving exhausted and humbled was the point. Important guests would be met at the Gates of the Moon by an Arryn escort, would rest there overnight, then begin the climb in the morning. The way castles provided opportunities for further rest, but also for the Arryns to demonstrate their power. Each castle was manned by loyal guards, each was stocked with supplies brought up from the valleys, each was a reminder that this approach could be defended at multiple points. The lords who held the way castles were chosen carefully, typically from cadet branches of House Arryn, or from houses that had proven their loyalty across generations. The position was an honour, a sign of trust, but it was also a burden. Living partway up the Giant's Lance, responsible for maintaining the climbing path, dealing with the occasional rockfall or storm damage, it required dedication and reliability. These lords became specialists in mountain craft, in understanding how stone shifted with the seasons, how to repair damage quickly, how to spot potential dangers before they became catastrophes. Winter posed special challenges for the Eyrie. When the snows came, the climbing path could become impassable for months at a time. The Arryns developed the practice of descending to the Gates of the Moon in autumn, moving their entire court to the lower castle, where they would remain until spring. This annual migration became its own ritual, a sign that winter was approaching, a time to prepare for the months of isolation ahead. Those who chose to remain in the Eyrie during winter, the guards who manned the towers, the servants who maintained the castle. They were volunteers, men who accepted extra pay, an extra prestige for enduring the harsh conditions of a mountain winter. The Vale's economy during these long centuries was based primarily on agriculture and trade. The fertile valleys produced surplus grain, cattle, and sheep that could be exported through Gulltown to other regions. In times of war elsewhere, when harvests failed and armies requisitioned supplies, Vale grain commanded high prices. The mountains provided less tangible but still valuable resources. Falcons captured and trained for hunting were prized throughout Westeros, and the Vale's falconers were considered the finest in the realm. The mountain streams and rivers powered mills for grinding grain, for fulling cloth, for other industrial purposes. The Vale developed a modest textile industry, producing wool and linen cloth that was known for its quality. While not as wealthy as the Reach with its vast fields or the Westerlands with its gold mines, the Vale was prosperous, its people generally well fed and secure, its lords able to maintain impressive courts and generous households. This prosperity and security had costs as well as benefits. The Vale's isolation and safety could breed complacency. When other regions faced existential threats, developed new military tactics, hardened their warriors in constant warfare, the Vale remained peaceful, its knights practicing in tournaments rather than testing themselves in real combat. There were periods when the Vale seemed to drift away from the larger currents of Westerosi politics, when the kings in the Eyrie paid little attention to what happened beyond their mountains, confident that those mountains would protect them from any danger. This attitude would be tested repeatedly across the centuries, times when events beyond the mountains demanded the Vale's attention, when isolation was no longer an option. Sometimes the Vale kings responded effectively, sending their knights to fight in distant wars, forming alliances with other kingdoms. Sometimes they remained aloof, watching as others fought and died, preserving their own strength. Both approaches had consequences. Both shaped how other kingdoms viewed the Vale. As either a reliable ally or an uncertain one, as knights of unquestioned honour or as lords who prioritised their own safety over larger concerns. The question of what House Arryn's words, as high as honour, actually meant was debated throughout these long centuries. Did it mean that honour should be the highest virtue, placed above all other considerations? Did it mean that the Arryns, dwelling in their mountaintop castle, embodied honour by virtue of their literal height? Did it mean that honour, like the mountains, was immovable and eternal? Different Arryn kings interpreted their words differently, and the Vale culture that grew around these words reflected this ambiguity. Some Arryn kings were known for their rigid adherence to honour even when pragmatism might have served better. They kept oaths that cost them dearly, refused advantageous betrayals, chose harder paths because they were the honourable ones. Others, equally devoted to their house words, interpreted honour more flexibly, understanding that a lord's first duty was to protect his people, that sometimes the greater honour lay in compromise rather than rigid principle. This tension between different conceptions of honour would persist throughout Arryn history, creating a culture that valued honour intensely, but didn't always agree on what honour required. By the time Aegon Targaryen was born on Dragonstone, by the time he began planning his conquest of the Seven Kingdoms, House Arryn had ruled the Vale for nearly 6,000 years. The current king was Ronel Arryn, a boy of perhaps 8 or 9 years, with his mother Queen Shara serving as regent. The Vale was prosperous and peaceful, its knights renowned throughout Westeros, its castles strong, its people secure behind their mountain walls. The Eyrie, that impossible castle built by Sir Artys millennia before, still stood white and beautiful at the top of the Giant's Lance, still seemed utterly impregnable to any imaginable attack. The Vale lords had heard rumours of dragons, certainly. Stories came across the narrow sea of the last Valyrian dragon lords on their smoking island. But dragons were creatures of legend, of distant lands, of ancient histories. They had nothing to do with the Vale, with its mountains and its knights, with its traditions stretching back through the mists of time. The Vale had never been conquered, not since the Andals had defeated the First Men 6,000 years before. The mountains protected it, the bloody gate guarded it, the Eyrie crowned it. Whatever happened in the wider world, the Vale would endure as it always had, unchanging and safe in its mountain fastness. This confidence, born of 4,000 years of relative security, would soon be tested in ways that no one in the Vale could have imagined. The age of Arryn kings was drawing to a close, though no one knew it yet. Dragons were coming to Westeros, and not even the mountains themselves would be high enough to escape their shadow. The year was 2 before Aegon's conquest, though of course no one called it that at the time, when a raven arrived at the Eyrie bearing a message that would change the Vale forever. The raven had come from Dragonstone, from a lord the Vale had barely heard of, someone named Aegon Targaryen. The message was brief and to the point. Aegon claimed lordship over all of Westeros by right of conquest yet to come, and he demanded that all the kings of the Seven Kingdoms bend the knee to him, or face destruction by fire and blood. It was an audacious claim, almost laughable in its presumption. One man ruling a single small island, demanding the submission of kingdoms that had stood for thousands of years. Queen Lysa Arryn read this message in the High Hall of the Eyrie, surrounded by her councillors and the lords of the Vale. She was by all accounts a beautiful woman, proud and intelligent, fiercely protective of her young son's inheritance. She had been born an Arryn herself, a cousin of the late king, and she understood Vale politics and Vale pride as only someone raised in that culture could. Her son Ronel sat beside her, a child with a child's understanding of the world, delighted by the raven itself, by the idea of messages carried by birds, not yet comprehending the gravity of what the message contained. The reaction in the High Hall was predictable. Some lords laughed outright at Aegon's presumption. Others were offended by the arrogance of this Valyrian upstart who dared to demand their submission. A few, more thoughtful, noted that the message mentioned dragons, and while dragons were creatures of legend, the Targaryens were known to be the last dragon lords, the only family to have survived Valyria's doom with their dragons intact. But even these cautious voices couldn't quite believe that dragons, if they existed, could pose a serious threat to the Vale. Queen Lysa's response to Aegon's message was carefully crafted. She did not simply refuse, didn't indulge in the kind of outright defiance that some other kings would offer. Instead, she sent back a letter that was both diplomatic and firm. She acknowledged Aegon's message, expressed interest in his dragons if they truly existed, and invited him to visit the Vale to discuss matters in person. But she also made clear that the Vale had never been conquered, that its mountains were impassable, that the Eyrie itself had never fallen to any attack in 6,000 years of history. The implication was obvious. You may conquer others, but you will not conquer us. This response reflected a calculation that seemed reasonable at the time. The Eyrie was, by all conventional military thinking, completely impregnable. To reach it, an army would first have to cross the Mountains of the Moon, either through the Bloody Gate, which could be held by a handful of men against thousands, or through the treacherous mountain passes where the clans would harass them at every step. Even if an army somehow reached the base of the Giant's Lance, they would then face the impossible task of storming the climbing path, fighting their way up through the way castles, assaulting a position where defenders held every advantage. No siege engine could reach the Eyrie, no battering ram could break down its gates, no undermining could weaken its foundations built on solid mountain stone. And even if, impossibly, an enemy reached the Eyrie itself, the castle was stocked to withstand a siege of years. Mountain streams provided fresh water, stores of grain and salt meat could feed the garrison indefinitely. The gardens produced vegetables even at this altitude. An attacker would grow old and die at the base of the mountain before the Eyrie surrendered. This had been true for 6,000 years, and Lysa saw no reason why it should change now, dragons or no dragons. But Lysa was also a careful ruler, and she began preparing the Vale's defences nonetheless. She sent messages to all the Vale lords, calling them to gather their knights and men-at-arms, not for immediate war but to be ready if war came. She reinforced the garrison at the Bloody Gate, ensured that the way castles were fully manned and supplied, and brought additional stores up to the area itself. If Aegon did prove to be a threat, if he somehow managed to bring war to the Vale, she would be ready. The Vale lords supported these preparations, but few of them truly believed that war would come. They had heard reports from the other kingdoms by now, knew that Aegon had landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush with only a few thousand men. Such a small force might trouble the Riverlands or the Stormlands, might even pose a challenge to the Reach, but it was nothing compared to the combined might of the Seven Kingdoms if they chose to unite against this invader. And even if Aegon conquered other regions, the Vale would remain safe behind its mountains, watching from its heights as lesser kingdoms fell. This complacency was perhaps understandable. The Vale had been secure for so long, its natural defences had proven so reliable across so many centuries, that imagining those defences becoming irrelevant required a leap of imagination that most Vale lords couldn't make. They thought in terms of armies and siege warfare, of the traditional forms of conflict that had defined Westeros for thousands of years. They couldn't quite grasp that Aegon was bringing something entirely new to Westeros, something that would make all their careful defences meaningless. The reports from the south grew more alarming as the year progressed. Aegon had defeated King Argilac of Storm's End at a place called the Last Storm, had killed the Storm King and conquered the Stormlands. He had burned Harrenhal, the mightiest fortress in all of Westeros, had melted its stones with dragonfire so hot that the towers had run like candles. The Riverlands had submitted without a fight, grateful to be freed from iron-born rule. But even these shocking events didn't fully penetrate the Vale's sense of security. Harrenhal was in the open, accessible to attack. The Stormlands had no natural defences like the Vale's mountains. What happened there couldn't happen here. Then came news of the Field of Fire, where the combined armies of the Reach and the Westerlands, 60,000 men under 2 kings, had been destroyed in a single afternoon by 3 dragons. 60,000 men, the largest army assembled in living memory, reduced to ash and charred bone in a matter of hours. The kings had died. Their heirs had bent the knee. 2 of the mightiest kingdoms in Westeros had submitted to Aegon's rule. This news finally broke through the Vale's complacency, finally made Shara and her councillors understand that they were facing something unprecedented, something that changed all the old calculations about war and power. Shara called her lords together again, and this time the mood in the High Hall was different. There was fear now, uncertainty, a recognition that the world had changed in ways they didn't fully understand. Some lords argued for raising the largest army the Vale had ever assembled, for marching south to join with whatever kingdom still resisted Aegon, for fighting this threat before it reached the mountains. Others counselled caution, pointing out that the Eyrie remained impregnable even to dragons, that they should wait behind their defences and let Aegon exhaust himself trying to reach them. But there was a problem with the defensive strategy that hadn't existed in previous conflicts. Dragons could fly. They didn't need to march armies through the Bloody Gate or climb the path to the Eyrie. They could simply fly over all the defences that had protected the Vale for millennia, could reach places that had been unreachable to any attacker in history. The Eyrie itself, that castle built on the assumption that its height made it safe, was actually more vulnerable to flying creatures than a castle in the lowlands would be. A dragon could land in the Eyrie's courtyards, could burn its wooden bridges and weirwood rafters, could turn the castle's height from an advantage into a trap, leaving the defenders nowhere to flee as the flames consumed them. This realization, when it fully sank in, was devastating to Vale pride. The Eyrie, the symbol of Arryn power for 6,000 years, the castle that had never fallen, was suddenly vulnerable in a way that no amount of conventional defensive preparation could address. Scorpions might be able to shoot down a dragon if the dragon flew close enough and the shooter was skilled enough and very lucky. But the Eyrie had no scorpions, no defences designed against aerial attack. Such defences had never been necessary before. Shara found herself in an impossible position. If she raised an army and marched south, she would be abandoning the defensive advantages that had always been the Vale's strength, taking her knights to fight in open country, where dragons could destroy them as easily as they had destroyed the armies at the Field of Fire. But if she remained in the Eyrie, she was inviting Aegon to simply fly there on his dragon and demonstrate that her supposedly impregnable fortress was nothing of the kind. Every option seemed to lead to defeat or submission. In the end, events moved faster than Vale councils could decide on a course of action. Before Shara had committed to any strategy, before the Vale army had even fully assembled, Aegon Targaryen came to the Eyrie. He came not with an army, not with threats or ultimatums delivered by Raven. He came alone, riding his dragon Balerion, the Black Dread, the largest dragon in the world, a creature so massive that when he spread his wings they could cover a town, whose shadow could darken entire fields. It was morning when Balerion appeared in the sky above the Eyrie. The guards in the tower saw him first, a distant shape growing larger, wings beating with a sound like thunder. They rang the bells, sounded the alarm. But what could they do? The castle's defences were designed against enemies who approached from below, who climbed the path or assaulted the gates. Against an enemy who approached from above, who could land wherever he pleased, the mighty Eyrie was defenceless as a village. Balerion circled the castle once, twice, giving everyone a chance to see him, to understand what had come to them. The dragon was black as midnight, his scales seeming to drink in the light, his eyes like pools of molten fire. When he opened his mouth, people could see into his throat, could see the fire building there, ready to be unleashed. He was ancient beyond measure, had hatched in Valyria before the Doom, had lived for more than a century, and his size reflected his age. He was a mountain given wings, a force of nature shaped like a beast, a creature that reduced the mightiest works of human hands to insignificance. Then Balerion descended, landing in the courtyard of the Eyrie itself, his claws scoring the white stone, his weight making the bridges creak. On his back sat Aegon Targaryen, dressed in armour of Valyrian steel with a crown of Valyrian steel upon his head. He dismounted calmly, showing no concern that he was alone in the heart of an enemy castle, surrounded by guards with spears and swords. What could those weapons do against a dragon? What could 100 guards do against dragonfire that could melt stone? Queen Shara came to meet him because what else could she do? She walked out into the courtyard with as much dignity as she could muster, her son Ronel beside her, her guards arrayed behind her. The contrast between the two groups was almost absurd. On one side, a queen and her household, lords in their finery, guards in their armour, all the trappings of centuries of royal power. On the other side, a single man and his dragon, but that dragon made all the difference, made all the Vale's power seem suddenly hollow and ceremonial. Aegon's message was simple, and was delivered without arrogance or cruelty. He had not come to burn the Eyrie or to harm the Arryns. He had come to demonstrate that he could, that the castle's defences meant nothing to a dragon rider, that the choice facing Shara was not between resistance and submission, but between submission and destruction. He could leave now, peacefully, and return with all 3 dragons and an army. He could reduce the Eyrie to melted stone and ash, could burn the valleys below, could turn the prosperous Vale into a wasteland. Or Shara could bend the knee now, acknowledge him as king, and keep her son's inheritance, keep her people safe, keep the Vale intact and prosperous under Targaryen rule. It was at this moment that young Ronel Arryn, who had been watching the dragon with the wonder that only a child can muster, spoke up. He asked Aegon if he could ride the dragon, could go flying like the Falcon Knight in the old stories. It was an innocent request, a child's excitement overwhelming his fear, and it changed everything. Aegon agreed, and Ronel climbed onto Balerion's back with Aegon's help, and they flew. 3 times they circled the Eyrie, Ronel laughing with delight, Aegon guiding Balerion in gentle spirals around the castle that the boy's ancestors had built. Shara watched from the courtyard, her heart in her throat, knowing that her son's life was entirely in this conqueror's hands, knowing that if Aegon chose, he could fly away with the boy or drop him to the stones far below. But Aegon returned him safely, landing again in the courtyard, helping the excited child down from the dragon's back. Ronal was transformed by the experience, babbling about how high they had flown, how he could see all the way to Gulltown, how the people in the valleys looked like ants from that height. He begged his mother to let him do it again, to let him fly more. And Shara, looking at her son's joy, at the dragon that could destroy everything she was meant to protect, at Aegon Targaryen, who had demonstrated his power while also showing mercy and even kindness to a child, made her decision. She bent the knee. There in the courtyard of the Eyrie, with the dragon watching and the Vale lords arrayed behind her, Queen Lysa Arryn knelt before Aegon Targaryen and swore that her son Ronel would be his loyal vassal, that the Vale would acknowledge him as king. The act took only moments. The words were simple, but they ended 6,000 years of Arryn independence, transformed kings into lords, changed the Vale forever. Aegon's terms were generous, as they had been with other kingdoms that submitted without forcing him to use dragonfire in earnest. Ronel would remain lord of the Vale, would keep the Eyrie and all his family's lands and incomes. The Vale lords would keep their holdings and their privileges. The Vale's laws and customs would remain in force. The only change was that the ultimate authority now rested with Aegon rather than with the Arryns, that the Vale was now one of 7 kingdoms united under the Iron Throne rather than an independent realm. For Shara, this was both a bitter defeat and a relief. She had failed to protect her son's inheritance of kingship, had surrendered what generations of her husband's ancestors had held, but she had kept him alive, kept the Vale intact, avoided the horror of dragonfire that had consumed Harrenhal and the armies at the Field of Fire. She'd seen Aegon's power demonstrated, but also his willingness to be merciful, and she had chosen the path that preserved her people, rather than the path that would have destroyed them in a futile defence of pride. The Vale Lords' reactions were mixed. Some, particularly the older lords who remembered the days of Ronald's father and grandfather, were ashamed that the Vale had surrendered without a fight, that the Eyrie's reputation for impregnability had been shattered so easily. Others, particularly those who had heard detailed accounts of the Field of Fire, were relieved that their knights had been spared the same fate. Bronze Jon Royce, the head of the ancient House Royce and one of the most powerful lords in the Vale, reportedly said that there was no shame in bending to dragons, that the first men had bent to the Andals when faced with superior weapons, that this was simply history repeating itself, that wise men adapted to new realities rather than dying for old ones. The common people of the Vale, when they learned what had happened, seemed to share this pragmatic view. They had not lost their homes or their lives. The valleys still produced their harvests, the mountains still protected them. That they now owed allegiance to a Targaryen king in King's Landing, rather than an Arryn king in the Eyrie, seemed an abstract change, less important than the fact that the transition had occurred without violence or destruction. The songs and stories about the Falcon Knight riding his giant bird took on new meaning, now that people had seen an actual dragon, now that they could imagine what it might have been like in those ancient days when legend and reality seemed closer together. Aegon stayed at the Eyrie for 3 days, and during that time he treated the Arryns and their lords with respect and courtesy. He consulted with Shara about the governance of the Vale, made it clear that he valued her wisdom and expected her to continue guiding her son. He spoke with the Vale lords, learned their names and their concerns, demonstrated that he was interested in being their king rather than simply their conqueror, and he flew young Ronel on Balerion several more times, cementing a bond with the child that would serve him well in years to come. When Aegon left, flying south toward the Riverlands on Balerion's back, the Vale had been transformed without a drop of blood being shed. The Eyrie still stood, white and beautiful at the top of the Giant's Lance. The Arryn still ruled from their mountaintop castle. The knights still trained in their tourney grounds, the farmers still worked their fields, The faith still held its services in the septs. Everything looked the same, and yet everything was different. The age of the Arryn kings was over, ended not by siege or storm, but by a child's laughter on a dragon's back, by a mother's wisdom in choosing survival over pride, by the simple reality that some changes cannot be resisted, only adapted to. The transformation from kingdom to lordship, from independence to vassalage, is never simple or complete in a single moment. No matter how decisive that moment might seem, Queen Shara's submission in the courtyard of the Eyrie was the beginning of a process, not its end, and the years that followed would test whether the Vale could truly adapt to its new place in a unified realm. The story of how the Arryns navigated this transition, how they maintained their identity and power while acknowledging Targaryen supremacy, reveals much about both the character of this ancient house and the nature of the realm that Aegon was building. Young Ronel Arryn grew up in a world very different from the one his father and grandfather had known. He would never be called a king, never wear a crown, never claim the absolute authority that his ancestors had wielded. But in many practical ways, his power over the Vale remained nearly as complete as any Arryn king before him. Aegon had promised that the Vale's laws and customs would remain intact, and he kept that promise. The Vale lords still owed their primary allegiance to House Arryn, still came to the Eyrie to settle their disputes, still looked to the Arryns for leadership and guidance. The main difference was that above the Arryns now sat the Iron Throne, a distant but ultimate authority that could overrule them if necessary. Ronald's relationship with Aegon, forged during those flights on Balerion's back, remained warm throughout both their lives. The boy who had laughed with delight as he soared above the Eyrie grew into a man who understood that the Targaryens had given him something valuable in exchange for the kingship they had taken. The king's peace that Aegon imposed on Westeros meant that the Vale's borders were secure in ways they had never been before. The constant low-level conflicts with neighbouring kingdoms, the border disputes and raids and occasional wars, all of that ended under Targaryen rule. The Vale could focus on internal development, on prosperity and culture, rather than on military defence against external threats. The mountain clans, however, remained as much a problem as they had ever been. The Targaryens had unified the Seven Kingdoms, but they had no interest in conquering the Mountains of the Moon, in spending blood and treasure to subdue people who posed no real threat to the realm. The clans continued their traditional raiding, and the Vale lords continued their traditional responses, and this ancient pattern persisted unchanged by the conquest. In a way, this continuity was reassuring to many Vale lords. If everything had changed, if even the eternal conflict with the mountain clans had somehow been resolved, the world might have felt too alien, too disconnected from the past. But the clans remained, a constant that connected the present to thousands of years of history. Ronald proved to be a capable lord. Aided by his mother's counsel in his early years, and then ruling effectively in his own right as he matured, he understood that the Vale's value to the Targaryens lay partly in its stability and prosperity, in its ability to contribute grain and gold and knights to the unified realm without requiring constant attention from King's Landing. He maintained the legal code that had governed the Vale for centuries, ensured that justice was available to both highborn and low, and fostered the culture of knighthood and honour that had always defined his homeland. The Eyrie continued to serve as the summer seat of House Arryn, though the annual migration to the Gates of the Moon each winter now took on additional significance. During the winter months when the court resided in the lower castle, it was easier for ravens from King's Landing to reach them, easier for lords from other regions to visit, easier to participate in the broader governance of the realm. The Eyrie, beautiful and symbolic as it was, had always been somewhat isolating. And this isolation became less practical now that the Arryns were part of a larger political structure. If you're finding these quiet explorations of how power transforms and adapts worthwhile, a like and subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps others discover these peaceful journeys through history, and I'm grateful to everyone who shares these calm endings to the day. And to those of you already subscribed, thank you for being here, for being part of this contemplative community. The relationship between the Vale and the Iron Throne evolved over the decades following the conquest. Aegon called upon Vale Knights to serve in various capacities, both military and administrative. When he needed trusted men to serve in the newly formed Kingsguard, the elite brotherhood of 7 knights sworn to protect the king, several came from the Vale. The Vale's reputation for producing honourable knights made it natural that they would be sought for this most honourable of positions. To have a son or brother chosen for the Kingsguard brought great prestige to a Vale house, and families competed to have their finest warriors selected for this service. The Vale also contributed men to Aegon's small council, the group of advisors who helped him govern the realm. The Master of Laws, responsible for ensuring that justice was administered fairly throughout the 7 kingdoms, was often a man from the Vale, where the legal tradition was strong and the commitment to order well established. These positions gave the Vale influence in King's Landing beyond what its size or population alone would warrant. And clever Arryn lords understood that maintaining this influence required sending their best men, not their surplus or unwanted sons. When Aegon died in 37 years after the conquest, the succession passed to his son Aenys without difficulty, but Aenys proved to be a weak and ineffective king. His reign was troubled by rebellions, most notably by the Faith Militant, radical warriors of the Faith of the Seven who refused to accept Targaryen rule because of the dynasty's practice of incestuous marriage. The Faith Militant uprising posed a particular challenge for the Vale, which was one of the most devout regions in the realm. Where the faith had deep roots and strong support among both nobles and commoners, the lords of the Vale found themselves torn between loyalty to the Iron Throne and sympathy for the Faith Militants' religious objections. Jon Arryn, still Lord of the Vale during this crisis, navigated this difficult situation with careful diplomacy. He made clear that the Vale would not rebel against the crown, that the oaths sworn to the Targaryens would be honoured. But he also worked quietly to moderate the conflict, to find compromises that might allow both sides to step back from open warfare. His efforts were only partially successful, but they established a pattern where the Vale served as a moderating influence, a voice for reason and negotiation rather than for escalation and violence. When Aenys died and was succeeded by his half-brother Maegor, called the Cruel, the situation worsened dramatically. Maegor was everything his brother had not been: strong, decisive, ruthless, and completely willing to use terror to maintain his rule. He unleashed dragon fire against the Faith Militant, burning septs and killing thousands, and he demanded absolute loyalty from all the great houses. The Vale, with its strong faith traditions and its history of independence, watched these events with growing concern. Ronel had died by this time, succeeded by his son, and the new Lord Arryn faced an even more difficult situation than his father had navigated. Some Vale lords urged him to rebel, to use the Vale's natural defences to resist Maegor's tyranny. Others counselled patience, pointing out that dragons could still fly, that the Eyrie's supposed impregnability had been proven illusory by Aegon's visit, that rebellion would only bring destruction. In the end, the Vale remained loyal, or at least obedient, but the relationship between the Arryns and the Iron Throne was strained in ways it had not been during Aegon's reign. Maegor's death, probably by suicide though the details were never entirely clear, brought relief throughout the realm and particularly in the Vale. His nephew Jaehaerys succeeded him, and Jaehaerys would prove to be one of the greatest kings Westeros had ever known. Called the Conciliator and the Old King, Jaehaerys ruled for 55 years, and during his reign the realm prospered as never before. The relationship between the Vale and the Iron Throne was repaired and strengthened under Jaehaerys, who understood the importance of respecting regional traditions and maintaining good relationships with the great houses. Jaehaerys visited the Vale several times during his reign, flying to the Eyrie on his dragon Vermithor, and holding court in the High Hall where Aegon had first demonstrated the futility of the castle's defences. But Jaehaerys came as a guest and friend rather than as a conqueror, and his visit strengthened the bonds between the Vale and the Targaryens. He consulted with the Lords Arryn on matters of governance, incorporated Vale legal traditions into the realm-wide law code he was developing, and showed genuine respect for the culture of honour and knighthood that defined the region. During Jaehaerys' reign, several Arryn lords served as Hand of the King, the monarch's chief advisor and administrator. This position, second in power only to the king himself, was a natural fit for the Arryns. With their long tradition of governance and their reputation for honour and competence, an Arryn serving as Hand would typically maintain a residence in King's Landing, while also keeping strong ties to the Vale, serving as a link between their homeland and the centre of power. This connection ensured that the Vale's interests and perspectives were represented in the highest levels of government. The question of succession within House Arryn followed the traditional pattern of male preference primogeniture, with lordship passing from father to eldest son. But the Vale had always been somewhat more flexible about female inheritance than some other regions, going back to Queen Lysa, who had ruled in her own right 1,000 years before. When male lines failed, daughters could inherit, and this provision would prove important several times during the Targaryen era when the Arryn male line came close to extinction. The economic relationship between the Vale and the unified realm was generally beneficial to both parties. The Vale's agricultural surplus found ready markets throughout Westeros, with Vale grain feeding King's Landing during lean years, and Vale cattle being driven to markets in the Riverlands and Crown Lands. The opening of new trade routes and the relative peace of the Targaryen era allowed Vale merchants to prosper in ways that had been difficult during the constant warfare of the earlier age. Gulltown grew larger and wealthier, its harbour crowded with ships from across the narrow sea and from every region of Westeros. But the Vale also paid cost for being part of the unified realm. Taxes flowed to King's Landing, gold that previous Arryn kings would have kept for themselves. When the Targaryens went to war, they called upon Vale Knights to fight, and these men sometimes died in conflicts that had nothing to do with Vale interests. The Vale's isolation, which had once been a strength, became a limitation in a realm where proximity to King's Landing brought advantages in terms of royal favour and political influence. The Dance of the Dragons, the devastating civil war that erupted about 130 years after Aegon's conquest, tested the Vale's loyalty and revealed divisions within the region. The war began as a succession dispute between Aegon II and his half-sister Rhaenyra, both claiming the Iron Throne, both having dragons, both willing to burn the realm to secure their crown. The Vale, like every other region, was pressed to choose a side. Lady Jane Arryn, ruling the Vale at the time, was a remarkable woman who navigated this crisis with skill and determination. She was relatively young, in her 20s, and she faced challenges from male cousins who questioned whether a woman should rule one of the Seven Kingdoms. But Jane proved herself more than capable, and her decision to support Rhaenyra's claim was both principled and strategic. She believed that Rhaenyra was the rightful heir, having been named such by the old king, and she understood that a woman successfully claiming the Iron Throne would strengthen her own position as a female ruler in the Vale. The Vale's support for Rhaenyra was crucial to her cause. Vale Knights formed a significant part of her armies, and Vale gold helped fund her war effort. But the conflict was devastating regardless of which side one supported. Dragons fought dragons in the skies above Westeros, castles burned, armies clashed in battles that killed thousands. The war dragged on for years, and by the time it ended both Aegon and Rhaenyra were dead. Most of the dragons were dead, and the realm was exhausted and traumatized. The Vale suffered less than some regions during the dance. Its natural defences meant that enemy armies rarely penetrated deep into its territory, and the fighting mostly occurred elsewhere. But Vale Knights died in distant battles. Vale gold was spent on a war that brought no glory or profit, and the psychic cost of the conflict, of watching the Targaryen dynasty tear itself apart, was significant. The dance revealed that the unified realm was not as stable as it had seemed during the long peace of Jaehaerys' reign, that the dragons that had created the realm could also destroy it. After the dance, as the realm slowly recovered, the Vale settled back into its familiar patterns. Lords Arryn succeeded one another in fairly regular succession, some more competent than others, none spectacular failures or legendary heroes. Simply men doing the work of governance in an era when that work was less dramatic than it had been during the Conquest or the Civil War. The Eyrie continued to dominate the skyline. The knights continued to train in their tourney grounds. The faith continued to hold strong in the hearts of the people. The extinction of the dragons, which occurred during the reign of Aegon III about 150 years after the Conquest, had profound implications for the entire realm, but perhaps less impact on the Vale than on other regions. The Vale had never relied on dragons for its security, had always depended on its mountains and its knights, and the disappearance of these creatures from the world was more symbolic than practical for most Vale lords. What it meant was that the Targaryens were now simply another royal house, distinguished by their silver hair and their history, but no longer possessing the overwhelming military advantage that had allowed Aegon to conquer in the first place. The relationship between the Arryns and the Targaryens remained generally positive through the following decades and centuries. When Targaryen kings were wise and just, the Vale prospered under their rule. When Targaryen kings were weak or mad, the Vale maintained its stability and waited for better days. The pattern established by Ronal Arryn's submission, of loyalty to the crown combined with significant regional autonomy, proved sustainable across generations. The Vale was part of the realm, contributed to it and benefited from it, but it also maintained its distinct identity, its special character, its sense that as high as honour meant something particular and valuable that was worth preserving. By the time of the Mad King Aerys II, nearly 300 years after Aegon's conquest, House Arryn had been loyal vassals of the Iron Throne longer than they had been independent kings. The thousands of years of Arryn kingship had become ancient history, while the Targaryen era was the present and the expected future. The Vale lords who gathered in the Aerys High Hall had never known anything but rule from King's Landing, had never imagined that things could be different. The transformation that had begun with a child's flight on a dragon's back was complete. The Vale was thoroughly integrated into the Seven Kingdoms, and it seemed that this arrangement would continue indefinitely, as permanent as the mountains themselves. But history, as the Vale would soon learn once again, has a way of surprising even those who think they understand its patterns. The stability of 3 centuries was about to be shattered, and the choices made by the next Lord Arryn would reshape not just the Vale, but all of Westeros, would bring down the Targaryen dynasty that had seemed eternal, would prove that sometimes the most honourable choice is also the most revolutionary. The man who would bring down the Targaryen dynasty was not a warrior king or a ruthless schemer, not a prophet or a revolutionary. He was simply a lord of the Vale who believed in honour and duty, who understood that some oaths matter more than others, who had the wisdom to know when saying no to a king becomes the most honourable path available. His name was Jon Arryn, and he became Lord of the Vale in a time when the realm seemed stable, when the Targaryen dynasty appeared secure despite its internal troubles, when no one could have predicted that within a generation everything would change. Jon Arryn was born into a cadet branch of House Arryn, not the direct line that had ruled the Vale for millennia, and his path to lordship came through a series of deaths that left him the nearest suitable heir. He was already a mature man when he inherited, in his 40s, someone who had spent decades observing Vale politics and Westerosi affairs, without the burden of knowing he would someday be responsible for them. This perspective perhaps gave him a clearer view of both the realm's strengths and its weaknesses, allowed him to see things that someone raised from birth to rule might have missed. By all accounts, Jon Arryn was the embodiment of Vale virtues. He was honourable to a degree that some might have called excessive, unwilling to break his word even when doing so would have been convenient or profitable. He was just, dealing fairly with both high lords and common petitioners who came before him in the High Hall. He was dutiful, understanding that lordship was a responsibility rather than a privilege, that the power he wielded existed to serve his people rather than his own interests. And he was wise, able to see beyond immediate concerns to longer-term consequences, patient in his judgments, thoughtful in his decisions. The Eyrie during Jon's lordship was much as it had been for centuries, perhaps for millennia. The white towers rose from the mountain peak, the moon door opened onto that terrifying drop to the stones far below, the gardens bloomed in their terraces, the streams provided fresh water, the halls echoed with the footsteps of generations. Jon maintained the ancient traditions, the annual migration to the gates of the moon in winter, the administration of Vale justice, the fostering of bonds between the great houses through marriages and wardships. Under his rule, the Vale was stable, prosperous, peaceful, in the way it had been for most of the Targaryen era. But Jon also understood that the Vale could not remain isolated from the wider realm, that connections to other great houses were valuable both politically and personally. He had himself married several times, his early marriages ending in tragedy as his wives died in childbirth or from illness, a common enough sorrow in Westeros where even the wealthy and powerful could not escape the dangers of disease and difficult births. These marriages had not produced living children, and this lack of an heir troubled Jon as he grew older. Knowing that the succession of House Arryn might once again depend on tracing distant family connections to find a suitable lord. The decision that would define Jon Arryn's legacy and reshape Westeros began with an offer from Lord Steffon Baratheon of Storm's End. Steffon had 2 young sons, Robert and Stannis, and he suggested that Jon foster one of them, that the boy could be raised in the Vale, learning from Jon's wisdom and example, creating bonds between the ancient houses of Arryn and Baratheon. Fostering was a common practice among the great houses, a way of creating alliances, of educating young lords in different traditions and perspectives, of building personal loyalties that could prove valuable in times of crisis. Jon agreed to foster Robert Baratheon, the elder of Steffon's sons, and this decision would prove more consequential than anyone could have imagined. Robert arrived at the Eyrie as a boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, already showing the physical strength and charisma that would define his later life. He was boisterous where Jon was measured, impulsive where Jon was thoughtful, quick to laughter and quick to anger. But there was also a fundamental decency in young Robert, a generosity of spirit, a loyalty to those he loved that Jon recognised and valued. Shortly after Robert's arrival, Lord Rickard Stark of Winterfell made a similar request. He had a second son, Eddard, called Ned, who would not inherit Winterfell and who would benefit from fostering in the Vale. Jon agreed, and soon both Robert and Ned were living in the Eyrie, training together, studying together, forming a friendship that would endure through everything that followed. The 3 of them, the ageing lord and the 2 boys, became something like a family, filling the void left by Jon's lack of natural children. The years of fostering were formative for all 3. Robert learned discipline he might never have acquired in Storm's End, where his strength and charm allowed him to get away with almost anything. Ned learned about honour from Jon's example, internalised the Vale commitment to duty and justice, and Jon discovered a paternal feeling he had thought lost to him, a sense that these boys were in some way his sons, that he had responsibilities to them that went beyond the formal obligations of a foster father. They trained in the yards of the Eyrie, Robert excelling with the warhammer he favoured, Ned more careful and precise in his sword work. They studied with the Maester, learning history and geography, mathematics and healing. They learned to hunt in the mountains, to fly falcons, to navigate the treacherous paths where a single misstep could mean death. They climbed to the way castles and learned to appreciate the engineering that had made the Eyrie possible. They sat in on councils where Jon dispensed justice, learning how a lord should govern. They became men in the Vale, shaped by its culture and its values. The tournament at Harrenhal, held in the year 281 after Aegon's conquest, was the greatest tourney in living memory, drawing knights and lords from across the realm. Jon Arryn attended, bringing Robert and Ned with him, and the events of that tournament would set in motion everything that followed. The details of what happened at Harrenhal, the jousting and the melee, the crowning of Lyanna Stark as Queen of Love and Beauty by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, the undercurrents of political intrigue that some would later claim had been the tournament's true purpose. All of this has been discussed and debated endlessly by those trying to understand how the realm came to civil war. What matters for our story is that tensions were rising throughout the realm, that King Aerys II was descending into madness, that his son Rhaegar's actions at the tournament troubled many lords, and that the bonds between great houses were being tested in ways they had not been for generations. Jon Arryn watched these developments with growing concern, understanding that the long peace of the Targaryen era might be coming to an end, that the choices he and other lords made in the coming years could determine the fate of the realm. The crisis came in the year 282 after the conquest. Prince Rhaegar had disappeared with Lyanna Stark, Ned's sister, and Robert's betrothed, either abducting her or eloping with her depending on whose version you believed. Brandon Stark, Ned's older brother and heir to Winterfell, had ridden to King's Landing demanding Rhaegar's death, and Aerys had arrested him for threatening the Crown Prince. Lord Rickard Stark had been summoned to answer for his son's actions, and Aerys had murdered both of them, burning Rickard alive while Brandon strangled himself trying to save his father. These killings were not just murders, but violations of every principle of justice and honour that governed Westerosi society. Lords were entitled to fair trials, not summary execution. Guest right and safe conduct were sacred, and Aerys had violated both. The Mad King had crossed a line, had demonstrated that no one was safe from his paranoia and cruelty, that the rule of law meant nothing when set against his whims. But Aerys was not finished. He sent messages to Jon Arryn and to various other lords demanding that they send him the heads of Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark. Robert was now Lord of Storm's End, his father having died in a shipwreck, and Ned was now Lord of Winterfell, inheriting after the murder of his father and brother. Aerys wanted them dead for no crime other than being friends of the murdered Starks, for existing as potential threats to his power, and he expected Jon Arryn to carry out these executions, to kill the boys he had fostered, to murder his wards in the name of royal authority. The choice Jon faced was terrible in its clarity. He could obey the king, could arrest Robert and Ned and send their heads to King's Landing, could preserve his own position and the Vale's security by following the letter of his oath to the Iron Throne. Many lords throughout history had made such choices, had prioritised survival over honour, had reasoned that dead men could not protect their people or maintain their houses. If Jon chose this path, he would be acting within the bounds of his legal obligations, even if those obligations were being twisted to serve a mad king's paranoid fantasies, or he could refuse. He could recognise that some commands are so unjust that obeying them would be a greater dishonour than rebellion, that loyalty to the crown must have limits, that there are moments when saying no is the only honourable choice even if it means war. If Jon chose this path, he would be breaking an oath that House Arryn had kept for nearly 300 years, would be raising his banners in rebellion against the dynasty his ancestors had served, would be risking everything his house had built and preserved. Jon Arryn chose rebellion. He refused the king's command, called his banners, and declared that the Vale would stand with Robert and Ned against the Mad King's tyranny. This decision, made in the High Hall of the Eyrie where generations of Arryns had dispensed justice and upheld the law, transformed Jon from a loyal vassal into a rebel lord, from a defender of the existing order into a revolutionary seeking to overthrow it. The reasons for Jon's choice were complex, rooted in both personal loyalty and political calculation, in deeply held principles and practical assessment of the situation. He loved Robert and Ned as sons, had invested years in their education and upbringing, and the idea of murdering them was personally abhorrent. But beyond this personal dimension, Jon understood that Aerys had made himself into a tyrant who had to be removed for the good of the realm. That allowing the Mad King to continue ruling would lead to greater disasters, that sometimes the preservation of order requires the temporary disruption of it. The Vale Lord's reaction to Jon's decision was overwhelmingly supportive. They too had been horrified by the murder of the Starks, had seen in Aerys's demand for Robert and Ned's heads a threat to all of them. If the king could order the execution of lords who had committed no crime, simply because he feared or disliked them, then no one was safe. The choice was not between rebellion and security, but between rebellion and submission to arbitrary tyranny. And the Vale, with its long tradition of honour and justice, with its culture of knighthood and duty, could not submit to such tyranny and maintain its self-respect. Bronze Jon Royce, the head of House Royce and one of the most powerful men in the Vale, was among the first to pledge his support. The other great houses followed, the Waynwoods and Hunters, the Belmores and Templetons, the Corbrays with their Valyrian steel sword. Within days of Jon's declaration, the Vale was mobilising for war, knights gathering at assembly points, supplies being stockpiled, the long peace of the Targaryen era ending as the mountain realm prepared to march. The war that followed, which would be called Robert's Rebellion, was a civil war that divided the realm, pitting great houses against each other, causing devastation across multiple regions. Jon Arryn's role was crucial not just in providing Vale knights to the rebel cause, but in serving as one of the rebellion's senior leaders, in helping to coordinate strategy, in lending legitimacy to what might otherwise have seemed like simple usurpation. His age and experience, his reputation for wisdom and honour, made him a natural choice as one of Robert's chief advisers. The Battle of the Bells, fought in the Riverlands, saw Vale knights fighting alongside Northern and Riverlands forces to save Robert from the army pursuing him. The battle was desperate and bloody, fought in the narrow streets of a town where cavalry charges were impossible, and the fighting came down to man against man with sword and axe. Vale knights distinguished themselves in the combat, their training and discipline proving decisive in the chaotic urban warfare. Robert survived, the rebel army won, and the momentum shifted in favour of the rebellion. At the Trident, the climactic battle of the war, thousands of Vale knights formed a crucial part of Robert's army. They fought under their own commanders, maintaining the distinct identity of the Vale forces even within the larger rebel coalition. When Robert killed Prince Rhaegar in single combat, when the Targaryen loyalist army broke and fled, Vale men were among those pursuing them, cutting down the fleeing soldiers, capturing those who surrendered. It was a complete victory, and it made Robert's claim to the throne nearly inevitable. But victory in battle is different from victory in governance, and as the fighting ended and the rebels had to decide how to rule the realm they had conquered, Jon Arryn's wisdom became even more important. Robert had the strongest claim to the throne by conquest and by distant blood, relation to the Targaryens, and he was acclaimed as king by the victorious lords. But Robert was young, not yet 20, more interested in hunting and drinking than in the tedious work of administration. He needed someone to actually run the realm, someone he could trust absolutely, someone with the experience and judgment to manage the complex task of governing 7 fractured kingdoms. Robert named Jon Arryn as his hand, making him the second most powerful man in the realm. The one responsible for day-to-day governance while Robert enjoyed the privileges of kingship without its burdens. It was a position the Arryns had held before during the Targaryen era, but never under these circumstances, never as the hand who had to rebuild a realm torn by civil war, who had to reconcile former enemies, who had to create legitimacy for a new dynasty that had come to power through rebellion. Jon accepted this responsibility, as he had accepted every other duty in his life, understanding it as an obligation rather than an honour, as work that needed to be done rather than a reward for his service. He moved to King's Landing, established himself in the Tower of the Hand, and began the patient work of reconstruction. He balanced the competing interests of the great houses, rewarded those who had supported Robert while finding ways to accommodate those who had fought for the Targaryens. He maintained the administrative structures that had governed the realm for 300 years, while reforming those aspects that had enabled Aerys's tyranny. The relationship between Jon and Robert during these years was complex, a mixture of genuine affection and growing frustration. Robert loved Jon as a father, trusted him completely, relied on him to handle everything he found boring or difficult. But Robert also resented the constraints of kingship, the responsibilities he had claimed by taking the throne. He wanted to be the warrior who had won the rebellion, not the administrator who had to manage its consequences. Jon tried to guide him, to help him become the king the realm needed, but Robert's fundamental nature resisted this guidance. Jon's personal life during this period was marked by continued difficulty. He married again, this time to Lysa Tully, a union arranged for political reasons to bind the Tullys to the new regime. Lysa was significantly younger than Jon, and the marriage was not a happy one. She suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, each loss deepening her instability, each tragedy making her more erratic and difficult. When she finally bore a living son, Robert Arryn, named for the king, the boy was sickly and weak, prone to shaking fits, coddled by his mother in ways that Jon found troubling but seemed unable to change. The governance of the realm occupied most of Jon's time and energy. He worked from dawn until late into the night, reading reports from across the Seven Kingdoms, meeting with petitioners, consulting with the other members of the small council, advising Robert on matters great and small. He was rebuilding the relationships between the Iron Throne and the great houses, creating new structures of authority to replace those that had been broken by the war, trying to establish Robert's reign on a foundation stable enough to endure. One of Jon's greatest challenges was managing the Lannister influence in the new regime. Robert had married Cersei Lannister as part of the political settlement after the war, binding the wealthy and powerful Lannisters to his cause. But this marriage brought complications, particularly as it became clear that Cersei despised Robert, and that Robert's drinking and infidelities were creating instability in the royal household. Jon tried to moderate between them, to keep their mutual contempt from becoming a political problem, but it was exhausting work with limited success. In the final years of his life, Jon began investigating something that troubled him deeply. He had noticed that all of Robert's children with Cersei had golden hair, while Robert's own hair was black, while his bastard children, scattered across the realm from his various affairs, all had black hair. Jon studied the genealogies of House Baratheon, read through the histories and discovered a pattern. Baratheon seed was strong. Black hair always dominated in Baratheon children. Had done so for generations. The implications were devastating. If Robert's children did not have black hair, they might not be his children at all. Jon confided his suspicions to few people, understanding the danger of what he had uncovered. If the Queen's children were not the king's, if they were bastards born of adultery, then the succession was compromised. The realm was being prepared to accept a false heir. But proving such a thing was nearly impossible, and making the accusation without proof would be catastrophic. Jon needed more time, needed to gather evidence, needed to figure out how to handle this situation without plunging the realm back into civil war. He never got that time. Lysa poisoned him, acting on instructions from Petyr Baelish, called Littlefinger, who was pursuing his own schemes for power. Jon died in his bed in King's Landing, his investigation incomplete, his knowledge unshared except with a few trusted allies. The realm mourned a man who had held it together through force of will and integrity, who had been the steady hand guiding a king who needed guidance, who had embodied the Vale values of honour and duty in service to a realm larger than his homeland. Jon Arryn's legacy was complex and contradictory. He had been a rebel who overthrew a dynasty, yet he was remembered for his loyalty and honour. He had broken an oath to the Targaryens, yet he was praised for his integrity. He had helped create a new regime, yet he spent his final years discovering that regime's fundamental corruption. He had fostered boys who became kings and lords, yet his own son was weak and sickly, unlikely to maintain the Arryn position he had inherited. The man who had held the realm together could not hold his own household together. The lord who had governed wisely could not manage his own wife's madness. But perhaps that's the nature of honour, that it's tested most severely not in dramatic moments of choice, but in the daily grind of trying to do right in complicated situations where right and wrong are not clearly marked. Jon Arryn had made his great choice when he refused to send Robert and Ned's heads to the Mad King, and everything else flowed from that moment. He had lived with the consequences, had tried to build something good from the ashes of rebellion, had worked until his death to serve the realm and uphold the values he believed in. As high as honour, the Arryn words proclaimed, and Jon had lived those words as fully as any man could, accepting that honour sometimes demands rebellion, that doing right sometimes means breaking rules, that the highest duty is to justice rather than to any throne or crown. The seeds of catastrophe are often planted in soil that looks fertile, by hands that seem gentle, in moments that appear unremarkable. Jon Arryn's marriage to Lysa Tully was such a planting, arranged for the soundest of political reasons, supported by all the right people, serving purposes that made perfect sense at the time. No one could have known that this union would ultimately destroy the man who had saved the realm, that it would unleash chaos across Westeros, that it would serve schemes so intricate that even now, looking back, we can barely trace all their threads. Lysa Tully was the younger daughter of Lord Hoster Tully of Riverrun, sister to Catelyn, who had married Eddard Stark. The Tullys had supported Robert's rebellion, had contributed men and resources to the cause, and a marriage alliance between Jon Arryn and Tully daughter was a way of cementing that support, of binding the great houses together in the new regime. Jon needed a wife, having lost his previous spouses to illness and childbirth complications, and he needed an heir to secure the succession of House Arryn. Lysa was young, a proven fertility from the Tully line, connected to powerful families. On parchment, the match made sense, but parchment doesn't capture the human realities beneath political arrangements. Lysa had loved another man, or thought she had, a boy named Petyr Baelish, who had grown up at Riverrun as a ward of her father. Petyr was lowborn. His grandfather had been a Braavosi sellsword who had been granted a few stones and a minor title for his service, hardly the match for a daughter of House Tully. But Lysa had loved him with the intensity that young people sometimes feel, had given herself to him, had become pregnant with his child. Her father had forced her to drink moon tea to end the pregnancy, had sent Petyr away, had arranged her marriage to Jon Arryn as a way of salvaging her prospects despite her indiscretion. Lysa came to her marriage broken in ways that weren't immediately apparent, carrying trauma and resentment that would shape everything that followed. She was married to a man old enough to be her grandfather, a man she'd never met before the wedding, a man who represented duty and obligation rather than love or passion. Jon was kind to her, as kind as his nature allowed, but he was also distracted by the enormous responsibilities of serving as Hand of the King. Often absent in mind even when present in body, unable to provide the attention and affection that Lysa desperately needed. The marriage produced pregnancy after pregnancy, but most ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Lysa's body seemed unable to carry children to term, or perhaps the trauma of the moon tea had damaged something essential, or perhaps it was simply cruel chance that medical understanding couldn't explain. Each loss deepened Lysa's instability. Each tiny corpse or painful bleeding made her more desperate, more erratic, more convinced that the world was conspiring against her happiness. Jon grieved these losses too, in his quieter way, but his grief was tempered by duty, by the understanding that personal tragedy could not prevent him from fulfilling his responsibilities to the realm. When Lysa finally bore a living son, when Robert Arryn came into the world small and sickly but breathing, her relief and joy transformed into an obsessive protectiveness that alarmed everyone who witnessed it. She would not let the boy out of her sight, insisted on nursing him herself long past the age when weaning should have occurred, interpreted every normal childhood ailment as a life-threatening crisis. The boy had seizures, shaking fits that the masters called falling sickness, and these episodes terrified Lysa into even greater vigilance. She saw danger everywhere, trusted no one with his care, wrapped him in protections that became a cage. Jon tried to intervene, tried to give his son the kind of upbringing that would make him into a capable lord, but Lysa resisted every attempt. When Jon suggested fostering the boy with another house, as he himself had fostered Robert Baratheon and Ned Stark, Lysa became hysterical. When Jon tried to limit her coddling, to insist that Robert learn to ride and hunt and fight as boys of his station must, Lysa would weep and rage and threaten. The marriage, never warm, became a battlefield fought over the raising of their son, with Lysa usually winning through sheer emotional intensity that Jon, exhausted by his duties in King's Landing, could not match. Into this troubled household came Petyr Baelish, called Littlefinger for his small stature and for the minor lands he had inherited. Petyr had risen far beyond his birth through cleverness and charm, had made himself useful to various lords, had demonstrated a genius for finance and administration that earned him a position on the small council as Master of Coin. He managed the crown's finances, found gold where previous masters had found only debts, made himself indispensable to the functioning of the realm. That he had once been Lysa's lover was known to few. That he maintained influence over her was suspected by fewer still. Petyr Baelish was a man of extraordinary patience and vision, someone who could wait years to achieve his goals, who could set pieces in motion and trust that they would fall into place when needed. His ambitions were vast, far beyond what anyone looking at his origins would have thought possible. He wanted power, wanted to rise from his lowborn status to become one of the most important men in Westeros, and he was willing to use anyone and anything to achieve this goal. Lysa was one of his tools, her love for him a lever he could pull when necessary, her instability something he cultivated rather than trying to cure. The relationship between Petyr and Lysa in King's Landing was conducted in shadows and secrets, meetings that looked like chance encounters, conversations that seemed innocent but carried other meanings. Lysa still loved him, or loved the memory of the boy he had been, and Petyr encouraged this love while giving nothing real in return. He promised her that someday they would be together, that Jon was old and would die soon, that she must be patient and trust him. And Lysa, desperate for affection, for some warmth in her cold marriage, believed him. Jon Arryn, focused on the realm's governance, on the daily crises that demanded his attention, did not see the danger growing in his own household. He knew Lysa was unhappy, knew their marriage was troubled, but he assumed these were personal problems that could be managed, that didn't threaten anything beyond their private misery. He was wrong, though he can hardly be blamed for not anticipating the depths of the conspiracy forming around him. The investigation that would ultimately cost Jon his life began with a small observation, the kind of detail that someone less careful might have overlooked. Jon noticed that all three of Queen Cersei's children, Joffrey, Myrcella and Tommen, had golden hair and green eyes, resembling their mother and her Lannister kin. This would not have been remarkable except that King Robert had black hair and blue eyes, strong Baratheon features that he had inherited from a long line of dark-haired ancestors. And more tellingly, all of Robert's acknowledged bastards, the children he had fathered in his various affairs and drunken encounters, had black hair. Every single one. Jon began studying the genealogies, spending his evenings in the library reading through the histories of House Baratheon. He found a pattern stretching back generations. Whenever a Baratheon married into another house, whenever Baratheon blood mixed with other bloodlines, the Baratheon features dominated. Black hair, blue eyes, strong builds. These characteristics persisted across marriages to Lannisters, to Tullys, to houses across Westeros. The seed was strong, as the histories phrased it. Baratheon features always won out over other bloodlines. The implication was devastating. If Robert's seed was strong, if Baratheon features always dominated, then his children with Cersei should have black hair. That they did not suggested that they were not his children at all, that Cersei had been unfaithful, that the children who would inherit the Iron Throne were bastards born of adultery. Jon's mind, trained in logic and law, followed this reasoning to its conclusion with growing horror. If Joffrey was not Robert's son, then his claim to the throne was false, then the entire succession was compromised. But suspicion was not proof, and Jon knew that making such an accusation without absolute certainty would be catastrophic. Accusing the Queen of adultery, claiming the heir to the throne was a bastard, these were charges that could start a war, that could tear apart the realm he had worked so hard to stabilise. He needed evidence. Needed to be absolutely certain before he acted. And he needed to be careful, because if Cersei discovered what he suspected, if the Lannisters learned that he was investigating the royal children's parentage, his life would be in danger. Jon shared his suspicions with very few people. He spoke with Stannis Baratheon, Robert's younger brother, a man known for his rigid adherence to law and duty. Stannis saw the same pattern Jon had seen, agreed that the evidence pointed toward adultery and false heirs, counselled that they needed to proceed carefully but firmly. Jon also consulted with Grandmaster Pycelle, asking about the genealogies, the bloodlines, the patterns of inheritance. Though he did not reveal the full scope of his concerns, and he began making discreet inquiries about Robert's bastards, wanting to see them himself, to confirm that they all carried Baratheon features. One bastard in particular drew Jon's attention, a girl named Barra, who had been born to a prostitute in King's Landing. Jon visited the child, saw her black hair and blue eyes, confirmed once again that Robert's seed produced Baratheon features regardless of the mother's colouring. He returned from this visit more certain than ever that Cersei's children could not be Robert's, that something had to be done, but still uncertain about how to proceed. The investigation was taking a toll on Jon's health. He was in his 70s now, an old man by Westerosi standards, and the stress of what he had discovered was enormous. He had trouble sleeping, his appetite diminished, he seemed to age visibly over the course of the weeks. Those close to him noticed the change, worried about him, urged him to rest. But Jon felt the pressure of time, knew that he couldn't delay forever. The decisions about the succession couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Jon's plan, as it developed, was to place young Robert Arryn as a ward with Stannis Baratheon on Dragonstone. This would serve multiple purposes. It would get the boy away from Lysa's smothering influence, would give him the kind of martial education Jon had always wanted for him. It would also put Robert under the protection of Stannis, who Jon trusted absolutely, who would keep the boy safe if the revelation about Cersei's children led to conflict. And perhaps most importantly, it would position his son away from King's Landing when the truth about the succession finally came to light. Lysa, predictably, was hysterical at the suggestion. She refused absolutely to let her son leave her care, accused Jon of trying to steal the boy from her, became so distraught that Jon temporarily abandoned the plan, intending to return to it once he had gathered more evidence and could insist more forcefully. This delay, born of Jon's desire to avoid conflict with his wife, would prove fatal. Petyr Baelish had been watching Jon's investigation with growing concern. As Master of Coin, as someone who made it his business to know everything that happened in the Red Keep, Petyr had sources of information throughout the castle. He knew that Jon was asking questions about the royal children, knew about the visits to Robert's bastards, knew that Jon was getting close to discovering the truth. And Petyr understood that this truth, if revealed, would create chaos, would destabilise the realm in ways that served his own ambitions. The Lannisters were powerful, wealthy, dangerous. If Jon exposed Cersei's adultery, the realm would fracture along predictable lines, with some houses supporting the Lannisters, others supporting whoever challenged them. In the chaos, a clever man could rise, could position himself to take advantage of the confusion, could perhaps achieve things that would be impossible in times of stability. But for this chaos to serve Petyr's purposes, Jon Arryn had to die before he could reveal what he knew. And the truth had to come out in a way that maximised conflict rather than allowing for peaceful resolution. Petyr went to Lysa with a simple message. Jon was planning to take her son away, to send Robert to Dragonstone where she would never see him, to destroy the one thing in her life that mattered. If she loved her son, if she wanted to protect him, she needed to act. And Petyr had a solution, a way to ensure that Robert would never be taken from her, a way to free herself from the cold marriage to the old man who didn't understand her. The poison was called the Tears of Lys, a subtle substance that mimicked the symptoms of natural illness, that killed slowly enough that suspicion rarely fell on those who administered it. Petyr provided it to Lysa, instructed her on how to use it, convinced her that this was the only way to protect her son, and Lysa, driven by love twisted into obsession, by years of unhappiness and resentment, by the promises Petyr made about their future together once she was free, agreed to murder her husband. Jon Arryn died in his bed in the Tower of the Hand, his death attributed to a sudden illness, a fever that struck quickly and killed within days. The misters who attended him could not explain why a man who had seemed healthy, if tired, should suddenly decline so rapidly. They spoke of humours out of balance, of age finally catching up with a man who had lived longer than most, of the mysterious ways that the body could fail. They did not suspect poison, did not look for murder in the death of a man so widely respected and trusted. Robert Baratheon wept when he learned of Jon's death, genuinely grieved for the man who had been like a father to him, who had guided him through rebellion and into kingship, who had managed the realm while Robert enjoyed the pleasures of being king without its responsibilities. But Robert's grief, sincere as it was, did not include suspicion that Jon had been murdered. Why would anyone kill Jon Arryn? He was the Hand, not the king. He had no enemies that Robert knew of, no one who would benefit from his death. Lysa left King's Landing almost immediately, taking young Robert and fleeing to the Vale before anyone could question her, before suspicion could fall on her. She claimed she needed to mourn in her homeland, needed to be away from the city that held so many unhappy memories, and Robert, in his grief and guilt, granted her this request without hesitation. She took her son home to the Eyrie, to the castle in the clouds, and there she would wait for Petyr's next instruction, for the next step in the plan that would plunge the realm into war. Before he died, Jon had sent one final letter, a message to his former ward Eddard Stark asking him to come to King's Landing, to serve as Hand of the King in Jon's place. The letter hinted at disturbing discoveries, at truths that needed to be shared, at dangers that threatened the realm. But the letter arrived after Jon was dead, after Lysa had fled, after the opportunity to prevent what was coming had passed. Ned would come to King's Landing, would follow the same trail of investigation that Jon had blazed, would discover the same terrible truth about Cersei's children. But without Jon's guidance, without the wisdom and experience that might have helped navigate the crisis, Ned's path would lead to catastrophe. Jon Arryn's final gift to the realm was the knowledge he had uncovered, the investigation he had begun but not completed. His final failure was that he died before he could share what he knew, in a way that might have prevented disaster, before he could ensure that the truth came to light through proper channels rather than through chaos and violence. The man who had held the realm together for 15 years could not hold it together from beyond the grave, and the seeds his death planted would grow into a war that would devastate Westeros. The Tears of Lys had accomplished what years of political manoeuvring could not, had removed the one man who might have managed the succession crisis peacefully, who might have found a way to expose the truth without tearing the realm apart. Petyr Baelish had gambled that Jon's death would serve his purposes, and that gamble would prove devastatingly correct. The realm was about to learn that stability depends on individuals, that when the right person dies at the right moment, everything can change, that honour and duty and wisdom, as valuable as they are, cannot protect against poison administered by those you trust. The Vale that Lysa Arryn returned to in the year 298 after Aegon's conquest was unchanged in its physical form, the same mountains and valleys, the same Eyrie rising white from the peak of the Giant's Lance, the same knights training in the yards and farmers working the fields. But Lysa herself had been transformed by murder and flight, by years of unhappiness crystallized into a single terrible act, by the knowledge that she had killed a good man to protect what she loved and to serve promises made by another. She came home carrying guilt and fear and obsession in equal measure, and these poisons would prove more destructive to the Vale than any invading army. The lords of the Vale welcomed their lady home with the respect due to the mother of their young lord, though many were troubled by the circumstances of her return. Jon Arryn's death had been sudden and unexpected, and while the official explanation of natural illness was accepted, some wondered why Lysa had left King's Landing so quickly, why she seemed so frightened, why she was so determined to seal the Vale away from the wider realm. Bronze Jon Royce, the head of House Royce and the most powerful lord in the Vale after the Arryns themselves, requested a private audience with Lysa shortly after her return, wanting to discuss the governance of the Vale and young Robert's education. Lysa's response to Bronze Jon's reasonable request was to refuse the meeting, to declare that she would govern the Vale as regent for her son and that she required no counsel from her bannermen. This was unusual, troubling even, as Arryn lords had traditionally worked closely with the other great houses, had understood that ruling the Vale required the cooperation and support of the regional powers. But Lysa was not interested in cooperation, was not interested in anything beyond protecting her son and waiting for Petyr's promised future. Young Robert Arryn was 6 years old when he returned to the Eyrie, a pale, sickly child who seemed younger than his years, who still nursed at his mother's breast despite being far too old for it, who had never been allowed to develop the independence that boys of his station needed. The shaking sickness that afflicted him had not improved with age. The seizures came with frightening regularity, and while the maesters assured Lysa that many children outgrew such ailments, she was convinced that only her constant vigilance kept him alive. The Eyrie became Lysa's fortress against a world she perceived as threatening. She kept Robert close to her at all times, would not allow him to train with other boys, forbade anyone to discipline or correct him, interpreted every suggestion about his upbringing as an attack on her motherhood. The maester who tried to insist on a more normal diet was dismissed. The master-at-arms who suggested Robert learn basic swordplay was told his services were no longer needed. Anyone who questioned Lysa's decisions found themselves excluded from her presence, shut out of the governance of the Vale. The wider realm was descending into chaos during these months, though the Vale remained largely isolated from the worst of it. King Robert had named Eddard Stark as his new hand, and Ned had come to King's Landing with his daughters, had begun to uncover the same truths that Jon Arryn had discovered. The conflict between the Starks and Lannisters was escalating, tensions were rising, and those who understood the political currents could feel war approaching. But Lysa, secure in her mountain fortress, seemed to believe that none of this concerned the Vale, that the mountains would protect them as they always had. Then came Catelyn Stark, Lysa's older sister, arriving at the Eyrie in circumstances that were complicated and dangerous. Catelyn had captured Tyrion Lannister, the Imp, the youngest son of Lord Tywin Lannister, believing that he had been responsible for an attempt on her son's life. She had brought him to the Vale seeking justice from her sister, seeking the protection of the Eyrie's impregnable walls, while she decided what to do with her prisoner. It was a decision that would have profound consequences, though perhaps not the ones Catelyn anticipated. The reunion between the sisters in the High Hall of the Eyrie was strained from the beginning. Catelyn had not seen Lysa in years, had last known her as an unhappy but relatively functional woman. The creature who sat in the high seat, with young Robert at her side and wildness in her eyes, was someone Catelyn barely recognised. Lysa's greeting was effusive but strange, her conversation jumping from topic to topic without clear connection, her laughter too loud and her tears too sudden. She seemed delighted to see her sister, seemed grateful for the company, but there was something fractured in her manner that suggested instability deeper than simple eccentricity. When Catelyn explained why she had come, when she presented Tyrion Lannister as her prisoner and asked for Lysa's help in bringing him to justice, Lysa's response was immediate and vengeful. She would try him, she declared, would hold court and determine his guilt, would see him punished for his crimes. The trial would be held in the High Hall, with the Lords of the Vale as witnesses, with the Moon Door waiting for those judged guilty. The trial of Tyrion Lannister in the Eyrie was a farce, a mockery of the justice that Jon Arryn had once dispensed in this same hall. Lysa sat in judgment, but she had already determined Tyrion's guilt before any evidence was presented. She accused him of murdering Jon, of poisoning her husband, though she offered no proof, and seemed to base the accusation on nothing more than her hatred of the Lannisters, and perhaps on some twisted need to deflect suspicion from her own guilt. Tyrion denied the charges, demanded a proper trial, pointed out the complete lack of evidence, but Lysa was unmoved. Young Robert, sitting beside his mother, watched the proceedings with the cruel curiosity of a child who has never been taught empathy or restraint. When Tyrion spoke, Robert would mock him, would mimic his voice, would laugh at his sighs. When Lysa described horrible punishments, Robert would clap his hands with delight, would beg his mother to throw the prisoner through the Moon Door. It was disturbing to watch, this child who should have been learning honour and justice instead learning cruelty and capriciousness, and some of the Vale lords present began to understand just how badly their young lord's education was being mishandled. Tyrion, facing execution for crimes he had not committed, demanded trial by combat as was his right under Westerosi law. Lysa could not deny this demand without openly violating every principle of justice, so she agreed. But she chose as her champion Sir Vardis Egan, the captain of the Eyries Guard, a skilled knight in full armour. Tyrion had no champions among the Vale lords, no one willing to fight for a Lannister against their own lady's chosen warrior. It seemed his doom was sealed. But Tyrion's sellsword companion, a common mercenary named Bronn, volunteered to serve as his champion. Bronn was everything the Vale Knights were not: lowborn, cynical, interested only in gold and survival, completely unconcerned with honour or chivalry. The fight between Bronn and Ser Vardis became a clash, not just of swords but of philosophies, of pragmatism against tradition, of effectiveness against appearances. Bronn won. He fought without honour, dodging and weaving, tiring the older knight in his heavy armour, using the high hall's space and the altitude's thin air to his advantage. When Ser Vardis was exhausted, Bronn killed him, and by the laws that governed trial by combat, Tyrion was declared innocent. Lysa had to release him, had to watch as he and Bronn left the Eyrie and made their way down the mountain, escaping her vengeance and her justice both. The trial's outcome enraged Lysa, who had been certain of Tyrion's guilt and eager to see him thrown through the Moon Door. But it also revealed something important to the Vale lords who had witnessed it. Their lady was not rational, not capable of the kind of impartial justice that the Vale had always prided itself on. She ruled by whim and emotion, saw conspiracies where none existed, and was raising their future lord to be equally unstable. Something needed to be done. But what? Lysa was the legal regent, her son was the lord of the Vale, and Westerosi law provided few options for removing a regent who was simply incompetent or mad, rather than actively treasonous. Catelyn left the Vale shortly after the trial, troubled by what she had seen in her sister, worried about the wider war that was clearly coming. She urged Lysa to honour the Tully alliance, to send Vale knights to support their nephew Robb Stark, who was gathering an army in the north. But Lysa refused absolutely. The Vale would remain neutral, she declared. The mountains would protect them, and they had no obligation to involve themselves in the conflicts of other regions. Let the rest of Westeros tear itself apart. The Vale would remain safe and untouched. This decision to remain neutral in what became known as the War of the Five Kings was one of the most controversial choices in Vale history. The Vale had military strength that could have been decisive, tens of thousands of knights and men-at-arms, fresh troops who had not been bloodied in the fighting that was consuming the Riverlands and the north. Bronze Yohn Royce and other lords argued passionately that the Vale should honour its alliances, that the Tullys and Starks had supported Robert's rebellion and deserved support in return, that sitting idle while their friends and kin were slaughtered was dishonourable. But Lysa would not be moved. She sealed the passes, reinforced the bloody gate, and gave orders that no Vale forces were to march to war. She kept the knights at home, kept the armies in their castles, and watched from her mountain heights as the realm descended into chaos. The War of the Five Kings raged across Westeros. Robb Stark won victories in the Riverlands. Stannis Baratheon besieged Storm's End. Renly Baratheon gathered a massive army in the Reach, and through it all the Vale remained static, its power unused, its potential wasted. The Vale Lords chafed under this enforced neutrality. Bronze Jon Royce was particularly vocal in his opposition, arguing that the Vale's honour was being stained by inaction, that they were abandoning their sworn allies. Others worried about practical consequences, about what would happen when the war ended, and they had to deal with whoever emerged victorious. If the Lannisters won, they would remember that the Vale had refused to help them. If the Starks won, they would remember that the Vale had abandoned them. Either way, the Vale's isolation was creating enemies. But Lysa remained in the Eyrie, increasingly paranoid and unstable, seeing threats everywhere, trusting no one. She relied on a small circle of advisors who told her what she wanted to hear, who encouraged her isolation, who helped her maintain the fiction that the Vale could remain apart from the realm's conflicts indefinitely. The governance of the region suffered as Lysa's attention focused entirely on her son, as she neglected the basic responsibilities of rulership in favour of hovering over Robert and protecting him from imagined dangers. The Eyrie itself, that symbol of Arryn power, began to feel less like a fortress and more like a prison. The lords who came to petition Lysa found themselves subjected to her paranoid questioning, accused of disloyalty if they disagreed with her decisions, sometimes threatened with the moon door if they pushed too hard. The atmosphere in the High Hall, which had once been a place of justice and reasonable governance, became tense and unpredictable, shaped by Lysa's moods and fears. Young Robert's development during these years was a tragedy unfolding in slow motion. He should have been learning to ride and fight, to govern and judge, to become the kind of lord the Vale needed. Instead, he remained permanently at his mother's side, denied the normal experiences of childhood, smothered by a tension that was really a form of neglect, prevented from growing into the responsibilities that would someday be his. His seizures continued, perhaps made worse by the stress of his abnormal upbringing, and Lysa's response was always to coddle him more, to restrict him further, to wrap him in protections that were really chains. The mountain clans, sensing the weakness in Vale leadership, became bolder in their raiding. Without strong direction from the Eyrie, without coordinated responses to their incursions, the clans pushed deeper into the valleys, stole more cattle, attacked more villages. Some Vale lords organised their own defensive measures, coordinated with neighbouring houses, but the lack of central leadership meant these efforts were less effective than they might have been. The eternal conflict between the Vale and the mountain clans, usually managed through a combination of deterrence and occasional punitive expeditions, became more one-sided as the clans gained confidence. Word began to reach the Vale of the horrors occurring elsewhere in the realm. The Red Wedding, where Robb Stark and his mother Catelyn had been murdered while under guest right, where the sacred laws of hospitality had been violated in the most brutal way possible, shocked even those Vale lords who had opposed involvement in the war. Catelyn had been Lysa's sister, had visited the Eyrie, had sought help that Lysa had refused. Now she was dead, along with her son and many of her followers, and the Lannister-Frey alliance responsible for the massacre was consolidating its control over the realm. Lysa's reaction to news of her sister's death was complex and troubling. She grieved, certainly, wept for the loss of her only sibling, but there was also a kind of relief in her mourning. A sense that Catelyn's death proved Lysa had been right to keep the Vale out of the war, that isolation had been the wise choice after all. She did not seek vengeance, did not consider using Vale forces to punish those responsible, seemed to view the whole tragedy as simply confirmation that the outside world was dangerous and that the Eyrie's walls were the only real safety. the Lords of the Vale began to organise themselves in opposition to Lysa's misrule, though they moved carefully, aware that open rebellion against their legal regent would violate the very principles of law and order they were trying to uphold. Bronze Jon Royce took the lead, gathering support from House Waynwood, House Hunter, House Belmore and others. They called themselves the Lords Declarant, and their goal was to force Lysa to accept their counsel, to govern the Vale in consultation with its great houses rather than by her whim alone, and most importantly to take young Robert away from his mother's influence and give him the proper education a future Lord of the Vale required. The confrontation between Lysa and the Lords Declarant never quite reached the crisis point it seemed to be approaching, because Petyr Baelish arrived in the Vale. Summoned by Lysa or arriving on his own initiative depending on whose account you believed, Petyr had risen even higher since Jon Arryn's death, had survived the various power struggles in King's Landing, had been granted Harrenhal and made Lord Paramount of the Trident, though his actual control over the Riverlands was tenuous at best. But he came to the Vale with charm and flattery, with promises and insinuations, with the skills that had allowed him to rise from near nothing to become one of the most powerful men in the realm. Lysa married Petyr in a small ceremony in the Eyrie Sept, fulfilling the promise he'd made to her years before, the future they would share once Jon was gone. The marriage was sudden, announced with little warning, and it shocked the Vale Lords who understood that Petyr Baelish was low-born, unsuitable, a man with no right to marry into House Arryn, and certainly no right to influence the governance of the Vale. But Lysa was regent, and she had the legal authority to marry whom she chose, and the Vale Lords found themselves confronted with a new Lord Protector, who was clever and dangerous in ways they were only beginning to understand. Petyr's management of the Lords Declarant was masterful, a demonstration of political skill that outmanoeuvred men who had been playing the Game of Thrones since before he was born. He met with them privately, flattered their concerns, seemed to agree with their goals, promised reforms while giving nothing substantive. He identified which lords could be bought and which could be frightened, which could be isolated and which needed to be accommodated. Within months, he had broken the Lords Declarant as a unified opposition, had turned some to his side, neutralised others, left the remainder too weak to challenge his position. But Lysa's happiness in finally achieving her long-promised marriage to Petyr was short-lived, measured in weeks rather than years. The exact circumstances of what happened in the High Hall of the Eyrie, of the confrontation between Lysa and Petyr and the young woman Petyr had brought with him, are known only to those who were present, and their accounts do not entirely agree. What is certain is that Lysa went through the moon door, that she fell 600 feet to the stones below, that her death was ruled an accident, though some suspected otherwise, and that Petyr Baelish was left as Lord Protector of the Vale, guardian to young Robert Arryn, the low-born man who had schemed for years suddenly in control of one of the 7 kingdoms. The death of Lysa Arryn left young Robert orphaned at age 8, lord of one of the 7 kingdoms without mother or father, dependent entirely on those who claimed to have his interests at heart, but who might have their own purposes. The official account of Lysa's death was that she had thrown herself through the moon door in a fit of madness, that her years of instability had finally culminated in self-destruction, that Lord Petyr Baelish and others had tried to stop her but failed. Most people in the Vale accepted this explanation, or at least pretended to, because the alternative, that Petyr had murdered her, was difficult to prove and dangerous to pursue. Petyr Baelish stood before the gathered lords of the Vale days after Lysa's death and explained what had happened with tears in his eyes and sorrow in his voice. He had loved Lysa since they were children together at Riverrun, he said. He had married her hoping to bring her happiness, to help her heal from the traumas of her past. But her madness had been too deep, her grief over her sister Catelyn's death too overwhelming, and in a moment of despair she had chosen to end her life. He had tried to save her, had reached for her as she ran toward the moon door, but he had been too late. Now he was left with the solemn duty of serving as Lord Protector to young Robert, of honouring Lysa's memory by ensuring her son received the care and education he needed. The speech was masterful, hitting exactly the right notes of grief and determination, of personal loss transformed into public duty. Some lords believed it completely, moved by Petyr's evident emotion. Others were more sceptical, noting the convenient timing of Lysa's death just as the Lords Declarant had been organising opposition to her rule, wondering how Petyr Baelish always seemed to benefit from the tragedies that befell others. But scepticism without proof was just suspicion, and suspicion was not grounds for action, particularly when the man being suspected had legal authority as Lord Protector and the backing of the Crown in King's Landing. Bronze Jon Royce was perhaps the most troubled by the situation, understanding that Petyr represented everything the Vale traditionally opposed: low-born origins, lack of martial honour, reliance on cunning rather than courage, pursuit of personal advancement over service to tradition. But Bronze Jon was also a practical man who understood that outright confrontation with the Lord Protector would destabilise the Vale at a time when stability was desperately needed. The War of the Five Kings was still raging across Westeros. The realm was fractured and bleeding, and internal conflict in the Vale would only make things worse. The compromise that emerged, negotiated carefully over weeks of discussion, gave the Lords Declarant significant influence over the governance of the Vale in exchange for accepting Petyr's position as Lord Protector. Young Robert would be fostered, not sent away to another region as Jon Arryn had wanted, but placed in the care of various Vale lords who would rotate responsibility for his education. Bronze Jon would have him for a season, then Lady Anya Waynwood, then others, ensuring that no single house dominated his upbringing, but also ensuring that he received proper training in the skills a lord needed. Petyr agreed to these terms with apparent grace, seeming to welcome the Vale lords' involvement, praising their wisdom and experience. But he also retained significant power over the actual administration of the Vale, over the disposition of its resources, over the decisions that shaped daily life throughout the region. And he had brought with him to the Vale a young woman he introduced as Elaine Stone, supposedly his natural daughter. A bastard he had fathered years ago and only recently acknowledged. He asked that she be accepted into Vale society, that she be given the courtesy due to a lord's daughter, even if she was baseborn, and the Vale lords agreed because refusing seemed petty, and because the girl herself seemed pleasant enough, quiet and courteous, showing none of her supposed father's calculating nature. If you're finding value in these explorations of how power shifts and transforms, how good intentions can lead to terrible outcomes, a like and subscribe would help others discover these peaceful journeys through history's complications. And to those already here, thank you for sharing these quiet contemplations. Elaine Stone was in truth Sansa Stark, eldest surviving child of Eddard Stark, a girl who had survived the fall of her house and the deaths of most of her family, who was wanted by the Crown for the murder of King Joffrey, even though she had played no part in his death. Petyr had spirited her away from King's Landing, had disguised her identity, and had brought her to the Vale where he could control her, could use her for purposes she was only beginning to understand. Sansa had suffered greatly since her father's execution, had been a prisoner in everything but name, had learned harsh lessons about power and survival that no child should have to learn. Now she was learning different lessons under Petyr's tutelage, lessons about manipulation and misdirection, about how to read people and use their desires against them. The relationship between Petyr and Sansa was complex and deeply troubling. He claimed to care for her, said he was protecting her, and in some ways this was true. He was keeping her hidden from those who would kill her, was teaching her skills that might help her survive and even thrive in a dangerous world. But he was also grooming her, shaping her to be someone useful to his plans, treating her sometimes as a daughter, and sometimes with an inappropriate intimacy that suggested he saw her as a replacement for her mother Catelyn, whom he had loved obsessively since youth. Sansa played the role of Elaine Stone carefully, understanding that her life depended on the deception holding. She dyed her hair, changed her mannerisms, adopted the speech patterns of a bastard girl rather than a great lady. She met with the Vale lords and their families, attended small gatherings, slowly became accepted as simply Lord Baelish's natural daughter, an unremarkable presence in the Eyrie and the Gates of the Moon. Only a very few knew her true identity, and those few understood that revealing it would mean her death, and possibly their own. Young Robert Arryn's response to his mother's death was complicated by his limited understanding of death itself, and by the fact that his relationship with Lysa had been so unhealthy. He grieved in the way children grieve, with sudden tears and equally sudden recoveries, with questions about where his mother had gone and when she would return. But he also seemed relieved in some ways, freed from the constant suffocating attention, able to interact with other children and try activities his mother had forbidden. The seizures continued, but the Maesters noted that they seemed slightly less frequent when Robert was less anxious, when he was engaged in normal play rather than sitting quietly at his mother's side. The fostering of Robert Arryn became a careful dance between different Vale houses, each lord trying to undo some of Lysa's damage, while also competing to be the one who most influenced the young lord. Bronze Jon Royce was perhaps too harsh, expecting an 8-year-old boy to show the discipline and courage of a grown man, pushing Robert to train with sword and shield before the boy had the strength or coordination for it. Lady Anya Waynwood was gentler but still firm, teaching Robert about governance and justice, about the responsibilities of lordship, trying to instill some sense of duty where Lysa had taught only entitlement. Petyr watched these efforts with apparent approval, never interfering directly, always seeming to support the fostering arrangement. But he also spent time with Robert himself, teaching the boy different lessons about how to read people, how to understand what they wanted, how to use others' desires to achieve your own goals. Whether these lessons would serve Robert well or corrupt him further was unclear, but they represented a very different kind of education than the Vale lords were providing. The question of Robert's eventual succession was complicated by his weak health and questionable prospects for survival to adulthood, let alone for producing heirs of his own. The Vale lords began paying attention to Harold Harding, called Harry the Heir, a distant cousin who stood to inherit the Vale if Robert died without children. Harry was everything Robert was not: healthy, strong, handsome, confident. Skilled with weapons and popular with both lords and commons, he was being fostered with Lady Waynwood, was training to be a knight, was developing into exactly the kind of lord the Vale needed. Petyr took an interest in Harry the Heir as well, cultivated a relationship with the boy, positioned himself as a mentor and supporter. If Robert died, if Harry inherited, Petyr wanted to ensure that he had influence over the new lord of the Vale. This attention to succession planning revealed Petyr's long-term thinking, his ability to plan moves ahead, to position himself advantageously regardless of how events unfolded. Whether Robert lived or died, whether Harry inherited or Robert produced his own heirs, Petyr would maintain his power and influence. The Vale under Petyr's protectorship was in some ways better governed than it had been under Lysa's paranoid rule, but it was also being slowly oriented toward Petyr's own purposes, rather than toward the traditional interests of the region. Trade through Gulltown was reorganized, with new arrangements that enriched Petyr's allies and created dependencies that could be exploited. The disposition of crown lands was adjusted, rewards given to lords who supported Petyr, penalties imposed on those who opposed him through subtle economic pressure rather than overt confrontation. The Lords Declarant, who had organised to oppose Lysa, found themselves outmanoeuvred and divided under Petyr's management. He had bought some with economic advantages, flattered others with positions of apparent importance, isolated those who refused to compromise, and created a situation where open opposition to him seemed futile. Bronze Jon remained suspicious and hostile, but increasingly alone in his opposition, unable to rally the other lords to unified action when Petyr seemed to be governing competently and when Robert Arryn was being properly educated. The wider war continued to rage across Westeros, and the Vale remained largely uninvolved, though this was now Petyr's decision rather than Lysa's. He kept the Vale's armies at home, preserved their strength, waited for the right moment to deploy them in ways that would serve his purposes. The other kingdoms were bleeding themselves dry in constant warfare, but the Vale remained fresh, its knights unblooded, its resources intact. When the time came to intervene, when Petyr decided the moment was right, the Vale would have disproportionate influence precisely because it had remained neutral for so long. Petyr's plans involving Sansa were gradually becoming clearer, though she herself understood only pieces of the design. She was the key to the north, the eldest surviving Stark, the person with the strongest claim to Winterfell. If Petyr could marry her to Harry the heir, could reveal her identity at the right moment and use the Vale's strength to support her claim, he could control both the North and the Vale, could become the power behind 2 of the 7 kingdoms. It was an audacious plan, dependent on countless variables falling into place, but Petyr had demonstrated repeatedly his ability to shape events, to turn chaos into opportunity. Robert Arryn's education continued, the boy slowly improving under the careful attention of his foster parents, learning skills his mother had never allowed him to develop. He learned to ride, though he was never going to be a great horseman. He learned basic swordplay, though his weak constitution meant he tired quickly and would never be a warrior. He learned about the governance of the Vale, about the great houses and their histories, about the responsibilities he would someday assume. Whether he would live long enough to assume those responsibilities, whether he would be capable of fulfilling them if he did, remained uncertain. The relationship between Robert and Sansa, between the young Lord of the Vale and the disguised Northern Princess, was one of the stranger dynamics in the complicated web of Vale politics. Robert became fond of Elaine, saw her almost as an older sister, trusted her in ways he trusted few others. Sansa treated him with kindness and patience, understanding what it was like to be a pawn in others' games, to have your identity shaped by forces beyond your control. If Robert knew who she really was, if he understood that Elaine Stone was actually Sansa Stark, would it change anything? Perhaps not. The boy was too young and too sheltered to understand the implications, but the secret remained carefully guarded nonetheless. The Gates of the Moon became the effective capital of the Vale during this period, more accessible than the Eyrie, more practical for the administration of the region. The Eyrie itself was abandoned each autumn as winter approached, its garrison minimal during the cold months when the climbing path became impassable. The white towers that had symbolized Arryn power for 6,000 years stood empty through the long winters, waiting for spring and the return of the lords to their ancient seat. The Vale's relationship with the Iron Throne during Petyr's protectorship was officially loyal but practically independent. Petyr sent the required taxes to King's Landing, acknowledged the authority of whoever sat on the throne, made the proper gestures of fealty. But he also kept the Vale's armies at home, refused requests for military support, maintained a careful neutrality that preserved the region's strength while the rest of the realm exhausted itself in warfare. This balancing act required constant attention, constant adjustment, constant careful management of relationships and perceptions. Bronze Jon Royce continued to represent traditional Vale values and to oppose Petyr's influence, though increasingly he was fighting a losing battle. The younger lords, those who'd come to power during the chaos of recent years, were more willing to accept Petyr's leadership, less bound to the old ways of honour and tradition. They saw that Petyr's methods worked, that his careful manipulation of economics and politics achieved results, that perhaps the new era required new approaches rather than adherence to codes developed in different times. The mountain clans remained a constant problem, their raids continuing, their boldness increasing as they sensed the uncertainty in Vale leadership. Some lords wanted to launch a major campaign against the clans, to finally solve this ancient problem through overwhelming force. Others counselled patience, pointing out that such campaigns had been tried countless times before and had never succeeded, that the mountains protected the clans as much as they protected the Vale itself. Petyr seemed uninterested in the clan problem, viewing it as a minor irritation rather than a serious threat, focusing his attention on larger strategic concerns. The future of House Arryn and the Vale hung in uncertain balance. Would Robert survive to adulthood? Would he be capable of ruling if he did? Would Harry the heir inherit instead? And what would that mean for the region's direction? Would Petyr's plans succeed? Would he manage to control the Vale indefinitely through his position as Lord Protector? Would the traditional lords eventually organise effective opposition? Would Bronze Jon and others find a way to remove Petyr and restore Vale governance to its traditional patterns? All of these questions remained unanswered, dependent on events that had not yet occurred, on choices that had not yet been made. What was clear was that the age of stable Arryn rule, of lords who embodied as high as honour and who governed according to ancient traditions, had ended. Whether temporarily or permanently, whether this was an aberration or a transformation, remained to be seen. The Eyrie still stood on its mountain peak. The Vale still produced its grain and its knights. The traditions still held some power. But the certainty that had characterised the region for millennia had been shattered, replaced by uncertainty and manipulation, by schemes and counter-schemes, by a future that could unfold in countless different ways depending on which of the competing visions for the Vale ultimately prevailed. We've travelled together through 8,000 years of history, from the mists of the Age of Heroes to the uncertain present, following a single house through conquest and submission, through honour maintained and honour tested, through the heights of power and the depths of manipulation. We've watched as mountains shaped a people, as a falcon became a symbol, as the words, "as high as honour," came to mean something both inspiring and complicated, something worth striving for even when the striving falls short. The Eyrie still stands tonight, as it has stood for 6 millennia, its white towers rising from the peak of the Giant's Lance, visible for miles across the valleys below. The moon door still opens onto that terrible drop, the way castles still mark the climbing path, the gates of the moon still guards the approach, and somewhere in those ancient halls, perhaps a young boy sleeps, dreaming of falcons and knights, of the inheritance he carries, of the weight and wonder of being an Arryn. You've listened well, friend, and I hope these hours we've spent together have brought you some peace, some gentle rest at the end of your day. Let the story settle now. Let the names and dates and complications drift away like morning mist in a mountain valley. You don't need to remember everything, don't need to hold on to any of it. Just let it all go. Let yourself sink into comfort and quiet. The realm sleeps tonight. All of Westeros resting under its stars, and you can rest too. As high as honour, yes, but sometimes honour is simply being kind to yourself, allowing yourself peace, accepting that you've done enough for today and can let the world continue without your vigilance. Sleep now. The mountains stand their watch. You need not.